I had been driving for hours, the dense forest surrounding me thickening as I veered off the main road. My destination was a small cabin tucked deep in the woods, a place I had discovered through a friend's recommendation months ago. I had been craving solitude, a break from the constant noise and pressure of the city, and the idea of a cabin hidden away from everything had seemed perfect. The GPS signal had already cut out miles back, and the road had narrowed to dirt tracks so overgrown with roots and brush that I had to slow my car to a crawl, shifting carefully around potholes and fallen branches. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees, and the forest seemed to breathe around me, quiet but immense, almost oppressive. When I finally spotted the cabin, it appeared almost hidden, its wooden exterior blending into the forest like it had been grown rather than built. A small plume of smoke rose from a chimney, or perhaps it had just been a trick of the fading light, but it gave the place a semblance of life. I parked on a patch of uneven grass and stepped out, the air instantly feeling cooler, heavier, and smelling of damp pine and earth. There were no other structures in sight, no sign of people, no roads leading back to civilization, just the relentless forest and the isolated cabin. The cabin was old, though not abandoned. The logs were darkened with age, some warped slightly, and the metal roof was rusted in places, but the windows were intact, and the door had a sturdy latch. I unlocked it and stepped inside, my boots leaving dark impressions on the rough wooden floor. The interior was sparsely furnished. A small table and chairs, a stove in the corner, and a bed in the far corner covered with a thin, worn quilt. Dust coated every surface, but it was not thick, as if someone had been here recently. I set down my backpack and ran my fingers over the rough-hewn table, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin settling. I lit a small lantern I had brought with me, its glow filling the space with warmth. Shadows flickered across the walls, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and mold. I unpacked some supplies, arranging them neatly on the table: water, canned food, a first aid kit, and a small stock of firewood for the stove. It was comforting to prepare, to organize, to make the space my own even temporarily. Outside, the forest was beginning to darken. The sky was a bruised purple, and the trees looked like black silhouettes against the dimming light. As night fell, the sounds of the forest grew. Insects chirped, leaves rustled, and occasionally, there was the distant thump of a branch breaking. My first night passed uneventfully, though I slept lightly, listening to every sound and every shadow moving outside. In the morning, I woke to the pale gray light filtering through the windows, the forest silent except for the occasional crow. I made coffee on the small stove, the aroma mingling with the earthy scent of the cabin, and ate a simple breakfast while sitting at the table, the quiet stretching out like a blanket around me. The next day, I decided to explore. I stepped outside and followed a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The undergrowth was thick, and I had to push branches aside, step over roots, and maneuver around fallen logs. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt, as though the forest was closing in, each tree a sentinel watching me pass. Birds flew overhead, startled by my presence, and occasionally, I caught sight of a deer slipping silently between the trunks. Hours passed, and I turned back before venturing too far. The sun had moved low in the sky, and shadows were stretching long and dark once again. Back at the cabin, I lit the stove to cook dinner, the warmth a relief against the chill that had crept in. I moved slowly, methodically, carrying the firewood, checking the windows and door, making sure everything was in order. It was then that I noticed the first real sign that something was not quite right. On the doorframe, faint scratches marred the wood, small but deep, as though something had tried to claw its way inside. I froze, my stomach tightening. The scratches were fresh, sharp against the worn wood, and I traced them carefully, noting the pattern and depth. Nothing was stolen or moved inside. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it could be an animal, a raccoon, or a bear, but the marks were vertical, deliberate, and deep. I checked the rest of the cabin, the back door, the windows, but found nothing else. Still, a chill ran down my spine, and I made sure the latch was secure before going to bed, the lantern casting long shadows across the walls. Sleep was uneasy, and I woke multiple times, each creak of the floor or snap of a twig outside making my heart race. The following morning, I found more evidence. Outside, around the cabin, small footprints were pressed into the dirt, partially obscured by fallen leaves, but unmistakably human. They were fresh, and they circled the cabin in a slow, methodical pattern. I froze, heart thudding, examining them carefully. They were small, perhaps a teenager or a smaller adult, and they stopped abruptly near the tree line, as if the person had been waiting, watching. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm, to think logically. I checked the cabin's perimeter, found no one, and considered my options. The nearest town was miles away, the trail rough, and I had no phone signal. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the door as best I could with a heavy chair, stocked water near my bed, and gathered firewood inside so I wouldn't need to go outside after dark. I checked my knife, my lighter, and my matches repeatedly, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down. I kept the lantern lit in the evening, casting light into every corner, every shadow, trying to create a barrier between myself and whatever might be outside. The wind blew through the trees, carrying strange noises that set my teeth on edge. Night came slowly. I sat near the stove, listening to the forest, alert to every movement. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint scratching at the door, deliberate and slow. I froze, the sound echoing in the tight space of the cabin. It continued, moving to the windows, tapping lightly, then stopping, as if whoever it was had gone around the cabin, waiting. My mind raced, weighing options, heart hammering. I did not have a gun, and I knew shouting would not help. The nearest neighbors were miles away, unreachable. I gripped my knife and waited, every muscle tense. Hours passed. The scratching stopped. I do not know if whoever it was left or simply hid in the shadows, but I remained vigilant, sitting near the stove with the knife in my hand until the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows. The forest outside seemed normal again, almost calm, as though the previous night had been a cruel dream. I forced myself to eat, to drink, and to gather my courage. The next day, I decided not to explore further. Instead, I prepared for the possibility of leaving. I packed my essentials, double-checked the cabin, and traced the path I had driven in, marking landmarks and noting the turns in the overgrown trail. I had resolved not to panic, to move carefully and deliberately, and to stay alert to any sign of movement in the trees. As I drove back along the dirt track, the forest seemed almost oppressive in the light of day, each tree shadowed, each rustle potentially dangerous. I kept my eyes on the trail, my hands tight on the wheel, and I did not stop until I reached the main road. Only then did I allow myself a deep breath, feeling the tension draining from my body, replaced by relief and exhaustion. In the safety of the town, I reported the incidents to the local authorities, who listened with polite concern and promised to investigate. They noted other similar reports of hikers and cabin visitors encountering intruders or strange footprints in the area, though no one had been harmed. I realized that while my experience had been terrifying, I had been lucky. I had relied on preparation, awareness, and caution, and that had kept me safe. Weeks later, the memory of the cabin remained vivid. I could still see the scratches on the door, the human footprints pressed into the soil, and the shadows in the forest at night. But I also remembered my careful planning, my deliberate steps, and the way I had maintained control even in the face of fear. I understood that fear itself could be managed with vigilance and preparation. I never returned to that cabin, but I carried the lesson with me. That isolation can expose you to danger, but rational thought and careful action can preserve your safety. And in that way, the cabin experience, terrifying as it had been, became a source of empowerment. I learned to respect the forest and its hidden risks, to trust my instincts, and to prepare for the unknown with patience and care. The story ended not with injury or catastrophe, but with awareness, survival, and the deep understanding that fear, faced calmly and methodically, could be transformed into clarity and resilience. I had been driving all day, the long stretch of road unrolling before me like a black ribbon through the thick forest. It was early October, the kind of early autumn where the air feels crisp in the morning but still has a warm bite from the day. The trees were turning shades of orange, red, and brown, and the wind carried the smell of damp leaves. My destination was a small cabin I had rented through an online listing, one that promised solitude, quiet, and a chance to disconnect from the constant hum of the city. I had been looking forward to it for months, needing some time alone, away from people, away from responsibilities, away from everything that made life feel heavy. The road became narrower the further I went. It turned from asphalt into a rough gravel track lined with dense trees that seemed to close in on me as I drove. My phone had already lost signal hours ago, and I had no GPS, relying on printed directions I had saved from the cabin's website. The isolation was both thrilling and slightly unnerving. I kept telling myself I loved this, the quiet, the solitude, the wilderness. But deep down, I could feel a thread of tension pulling through me. A subtle awareness that I was alone in a place no one knew I was heading to. When I finally reached the turn for the cabin, it was a small wooden sign barely visible from the road, half hidden by overgrown shrubs. The driveway leading up to the cabin was steep, lined with rocks and fallen branches. My car rattled along the path, and I had to slow down to avoid scraping the undercarriage. When I finally came over the last hill, the cabin came into view. A 2-story wooden structure with a small porch, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. It looked exactly like the photos online, almost too perfect, like a postcard. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. There was a small creek nearby, its water glinting faintly in the sunlight, and a pile of firewood stacked neatly by the side of the house. I parked, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was cool and sharp, the kind of air that makes your lungs feel alive. I carried my bag up the porch steps and pushed open the door. The smell of the cabin hit me first. A mix of old wood, faint mildew, and something earthy, like damp soil. It was a cabin that had clearly been used before, but it had been cleaned and prepared for guests. Inside, the cabin was cozy but sparse. The living area had a fireplace, a small sofa, and a wooden dining table. The kitchen was simple with a sink, a stove, and a few cupboards, but I had brought my own food and supplies, so I didn't care much about the lack of amenities. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms, each with a bed, a dresser, and thick blankets folded neatly at the foot. I chose the smaller room at the back, which had a window overlooking the creek. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire in the fireplace, made a simple dinner, and read a book until my eyes grew heavy. Outside, the forest was dark and silent, save for the occasional sound of wind through the trees or a distant animal rustling in the underbrush. The darkness was complete, almost suffocating in its density, but I had grown used to it after a few hours. I went to bed, feeling the tension in my body ease. The second day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, filled with towering pines and oaks, their leaves carpeting the ground. I followed the creek upstream, slipping on wet rocks and trying not to disturb the fragile ecosystem around me. I came across a small clearing, the kind where sunlight pours in like golden water, illuminating the forest floor. It was beautiful, almost too serene, and I found myself pausing, trying to soak in every detail. The sound of the water trickling over rocks, the scent of pine needles, the occasional bird call. As I wandered further, I realized the forest was thicker than it had seemed from the cabin. Paths disappeared quickly, and the undergrowth made progress slow. I noted landmarks to guide my way back. An oddly shaped tree, a large rock, the sound of a particular waterfall I could hear in the distance. I lost track of time, caught up in the beauty and the peaceful isolation. When I finally returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the clearing, and a chill had settled into the air. That night, I went to bed early, but around midnight, I woke to a sound I hadn't expected, the creak of the floorboards downstairs. I froze, listening intently, heart hammering. The sound came again, deliberate, slow, and unmistakable. Someone or something was in the cabin. I told myself it had to be the wind or the old wood settling, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The creaks repeated, moving toward the staircase, each step deliberate, careful. My mind raced through possibilities. A burglar, a squatter, an animal that had found a way in. I didn't have a weapon, only a small kitchen knife tucked under my pillow. I stayed still, straining to hear. The sound stopped for a moment, then began again, this time at the living room window. I could hear a faint tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the glass. My stomach turned cold. I considered running, but I knew the only way out was the front door, and whoever or whatever was there could see me from outside. I waited, breathing quietly, trying to make myself invisible. Hours seemed to pass. Eventually, the tapping stopped, the creaking faded, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed awake, knife in hand, listening to every sound. The wind, the trees, the creak, anything that might indicate movement. By morning, I was exhausted, jittery, and on edge, but relieved that I had made it through the night without a direct confrontation. The following day, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the mud or leaves, nothing to indicate anyone had been inside. The window was closed, the lock intact. It didn't make sense, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I considered leaving, but I had driven so far and committed to a week at the cabin. Part of me wanted to leave, but another part of me refused to let fear dictate my plans. I decided to take extra precautions. I moved the furniture so that the bedroom door could be blocked, placed heavy objects near the windows, and kept my phone close, even if it had no signal. I also made sure the firewood and any items that could be used as weapons were easily accessible. The tension in my body never fully eased, but I tried to convince myself that these measures would help. For the next 2 days, nothing happened. The forest remained eerily quiet, and the isolation felt both peaceful and oppressive. I explored further along the creek, taking care not to get lost, and returned to the cabin each evening, lighting the fireplace early and securing the windows and doors. I kept a careful watch, eyes constantly scanning the shadows, listening for any unusual sound. On the 4th night, something changed. I was asleep when I felt the bed shift slightly, a pressure on the mattress as if someone had leaned down beside me. I froze, heart racing, every muscle tensed. The pressure lifted almost immediately, but it was enough to send me into a panic. I grabbed my knife and stayed in a crouched position, listening intently. There was no sound, nothing to indicate someone was still in the room. But I knew then that this was no ordinary break-in attempt. Whoever or whatever had been in the cabin knew my routine, knew where I was sleeping. I realized then that I couldn't stay another night without some kind of backup plan. I had to find a way to get help. I remembered a ranger station that was supposed to be a few miles down the main road. I packed a small bag with essentials, water, food, my phone, a flashlight, and my knife, and waited until the first light of dawn. By the time I stepped outside, the air was heavy with mist, and the forest seemed alive with muted sounds, the rustle of leaves, the faint gurgle of the creek. I stayed on the gravel driveway, moving slowly, listening, ready to react. The car was still parked where I had left it, which was a relief, but I didn't let my guard down. I drove slowly back down the winding road, eyes constantly scanning the treeline, heart thudding. It took longer than I expected to reach the main road, and when I did, I saw the ranger station in the distance. I pulled in and immediately explained the situation to the ranger on duty. They listened, took notes, and dispatched a search of the cabin. Later, they informed me that they had found signs of forced entry, scratches on the door frame, footprints outside that didn't belong to me, and evidence that someone had been inside the cabin at some point. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Relief because I was safe, fear because I knew how close I had come to real danger. I stayed at the ranger station for the next night, and the next morning, I returned to the city, determined not to be alone in the forest again anytime soon. The cabin was beautiful, serene, and perfect in photographs, but the experience taught me that appearances could be deceiving, that isolation could make you vulnerable, had planned the trip for months, meticulously organizing every detail. I wanted to escape the noise, the constant hum of the city, the endless obligations that clung to me like a second skin. I had found a cabin online, tucked away deep in the woods of northern Maine, far from the main roads, far from the world. The pictures were simple, rustic, and inviting. A log cabin with a stone chimney, a small wooden deck overlooking a frozen creek, surrounded by thick evergreens. It promised solitude and silence, a place to breathe without interruptions. I packed carefully, layers of warm clothes, sturdy boots, food for several days, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. I had a phone, fully charged, though I knew the chances of signal were slim. My only real companion on this trip was a journal and a pen, which I intended to use to document the experience, maybe even sketch some of the surrounding landscape. The drive had been long, over 3 hours from the nearest town. The roads became narrower, twisting between dense stands of pines and birches. The air smelled of damp earth and frozen leaves. By the time I reached the last junction, a narrow dirt track leading deeper into the forest, the sun was low, the sky a dull gray. The cabin was not on a main path, and I had to follow directions written in an email from the owner. The track was rutted, frozen mud clinging to my tires, branches scraping the sides of the car. When I finally saw it, half hidden among the trees, the cabin looked smaller than the pictures, more isolated, more final somehow. I parked, stepped out, and felt the air immediately. It was crisp, sharp with the smell of pine and cold stone. The wind moved through the trees, making them sway and creak. The silence was profound, the kind that presses against your ears. I grabbed my bags and approached the cabin. The door had a simple lock, and the keys provided fit perfectly. Inside, it was small but cozy. A wood stove sat in the corner, some basic furniture, shelves with a few worn books. There was a kitchen area with a stove, a sink, and cabinets, all old but functional. A small bathroom with a shower, and a loft for sleeping. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable enough for a few days of solitude. I unpacked, laid out my supplies, and started a small fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly, filling the cabin, pushing back the chill that clung to the corners. I ate a simple meal, bread and cheese, and then sat by the fire, looking out the window at the darkening forest. Shadows stretched long and strange between the trees. As night fell, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, whistling through the cracks in the logs. I went to bed early, the quiet pressing down in a way that felt almost physical. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke several times, startled by the sound of branches scraping against the cabin, the wind moaning around the corners. But there was no real danger, just the deep, unsettling isolation. The next day, I explored the area, walking along the frozen creek, noting the tracks of animals in the snow. Deer, maybe a fox, some birds. The forest was alive in ways I hadn't noticed in the city. The sky was pale, the sun a weak disk behind clouds, casting everything in muted gray. I found some firewood along the creek, dry branches that had fallen, and brought them back to the cabin. On the third day, things started to feel different. It began with small, almost imperceptible signs. I noticed the woodpile outside was slightly moved, branches disturbed as if someone had brushed against them. I convinced myself it was the wind or an animal. Later, while chopping firewood, I saw fresh tracks in the snow, leading from the forest toward the cabin. They were boot prints, not animal tracks, and they were too large and defined to be my own. My stomach sank. I retraced them. There were no footprints leading back into the forest, only approaching the cabin. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was hunters or hikers or someone else using the woods. I told myself the cabin was still remote. Whoever it was would likely leave. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, moving the furniture to block the door and keeping a heavy stick near my bed. Night fell darker than before. The wind had shifted. It carried strange sounds now, the snapping of twigs and distant cracking. Every noise made me jump. I barely slept, dozing intermittently, ears straining for the smallest sound. Morning brought a brief reprieve. The snow had fallen overnight, covering the tracks. I thought maybe I was imagining things. I ventured outside, cautiously, scanning the forest. It looked empty, untouched, serene. I decided to go for a longer walk, taking my compass and map, just to stretch my legs. As I walked, I tried to rationalize the fear gnawing at me. The forest was vast, and there was little chance anyone would stumble upon the cabin unnoticed. Still, the isolation made my mind race, imagining shadows moving in the trees, shapes that weren't really there. That afternoon, when I returned, I found the cabin had been entered. The door was unlocked, even though I remembered locking it. Inside, things were slightly moved, drawers half open, a blanket pulled from the bed. Nothing was taken, at least that I could see, but the message was clear. Someone had been inside while I was out. My heart pounded, my hands shook. I called the nearest ranger station from the cabin, and after a tense conversation, they told me the area was remote, and it was rare but not impossible for people to wander in or break in. They advised me to leave immediately. I debated it, feeling the weight of isolation and fear. I couldn't stay here. It was no longer safe. I packed quickly, taking only essentials. The snow had stopped, leaving the forest eerily quiet. I made my way back to the car slowly, constantly scanning the tree line, my nerves stretched thin. At one point, I thought I heard someone running behind me, but when I turned, nothing was there. My pace quickened. The path was slippery, the tires struggling on the frozen dirt track. I kept glancing into the forest, expecting to see someone emerge, but it remained empty. By late afternoon, I finally reached the main road. The sight of another car, the sign of civilization, brought a wave of relief so strong it made me dizzy. I stopped immediately and called the ranger station again, telling them what had happened. They promised to send a patrol to check the cabin. I drove the last few miles without incident, the city lights finally in view. The contrast was overwhelming. The safety of streets, people, and traffic after days of solitude and creeping fear. In the days that followed, I learned the details. Someone had been living in the woods nearby, moving silently, observing cabins, breaking in when it seemed no one was present. They had no supernatural plan, no fantastical reason, just human curiosity, human threat. The authorities had caught them eventually, based on reports from other cabin owners in the area. Nothing was stolen from me, but they had left a mark on my psyche, a reminder that isolation in the wilderness comes with real, tangible dangers. The experience taught me a lesson about vulnerability and preparedness. I realized that even with careful planning, the natural world, and the human world hidden within it, can be unpredictable and threatening. I returned home, shaken but safe, and I never visited that area again. I still think about the cabin sometimes, the way the forest felt alive with silent observation, the way fear could seep in so slowly and completely. But I also learned to respect both the wilderness and the people who inhabit it, visible or unseen. In the end, I survived, and that survival, the careful, measured escape, was a victory in itself. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself it would be a break from the noise and routine of life. A few days alone in the woods, away from phones, people, and the endless deadlines that seemed to define my days. The cabin I found online was small and isolated, perched on the edge of a dense forest with a small stream running past it. The pictures made it look quaint, cozy even. I imagined myself sitting by a fire, reading, watching the trees sway in the wind, and feeling entirely disconnected from the world. I didn't know then how wrong my sense of peace would turn out to be. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet. I left in the late afternoon, taking a winding road that cut through thick pine forests, the kind of road where even the smallest noise seemed amplified. At first, it was beautiful. The way the sunlight filtered through the needles, the scent of damp earth and sap thick in the air. But as I drove deeper, I realized how little human presence there was. No houses, no trucks passing, no lights. Only trees, the road, and the occasional bird startled into flight. I thought I had overestimated how alone I would feel here. The cabin itself was even smaller than I imagined. A single story, built of rough-hewn logs, with a metal roof that looked like it had weathered decades of storms. There was a small porch, and I could hear the stream behind it before I even stepped out of the car. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and dust, and a faint, musty odor lingered in the corners. The kind of smell that told you the cabin had been empty for a while. The furniture was sparse. A bed, a table with a couple of chairs, and a small wood stove in the corner. There were shelves with old jars and cans, some of which were rusty, some of which were clearly decades old. I thought about washing my hands after touching anything, though I wasn't sure what germs or mold might be hiding in there. The first night was calm, almost too calm. The only sound was the stream, rushing over rocks, and occasionally the wind rattling the roof. I lit a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth creep across the room, and lay down with a book, thinking that I was finally alone in the way I had wanted. But I also noticed the quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't just an absence of sound, but a presence itself. It pressed against the windows, filled the corners, made my own breathing seem too loud. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. The next morning, I went for a walk along the stream. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick and wet from an early frost. I didn't have a set plan, just wanted to explore a little, take in the silence. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were fresh, muddy, large. Human footprints. Not deer, not elk. Human. They led from the back of the cabin, deeper into the woods, and then disappeared. My stomach sank, but I told myself it was probably a hiker who had gone in and out before I arrived. Still, I made a mental note to keep the cabin door locked. Back at the cabin, I tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every rustle of leaves made me tense. Every snap of a twig outside the window made my heart jump. I checked the locks on the door multiple times and even moved some furniture in front of it. The sun began to set, and I decided to cook dinner. The stove took forever to heat, and by the time I had a small pan of beans warmed, the forest outside was already dark, shadows thickening into forms that seemed alive. That night, the sounds started. Not outside, not exactly, but inside the walls, I could hear it. Scratches, soft and irregular, coming from the direction of the attic or perhaps the walls themselves. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just the wood contracting in the cold, or perhaps a mouse. But it didn't feel like a mouse. The rhythm wasn't right, too deliberate, too variable. It continued for hours, stopping only when I held my breath and stared at the ceiling. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night sitting in a chair, listening to the scratches, the occasional groan of the cabin settling, and my own heart pounding in the silence. By morning, I was exhausted. I resolved to leave, even though I had come prepared to stay for a week. But when I tried to start the car, the battery was dead. I hadn't noticed before, but the cables were corroded, the connections loose. I tried multiple times, even bump starting it, but nothing worked. The nearest town was at least 15 miles back down the winding road, through the forest. I felt a rising panic as I realized I was truly trapped. Not trapped in the cabin exactly, but trapped in the forest, alone, without a working car, without a phone signal. The isolation that had seemed inviting suddenly felt like a trap. The next day, I decided to hike back to the main road. I packed a bag, left some supplies in the cabin, and started down the forest trail. At first, it was easy enough, but soon I realized the path I thought I remembered was gone. The forest had a way of hiding landmarks, of making you turn in circles without noticing. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher and then lower again, and still I had no clear direction. My shoes were wet, my legs scratched from thorns, my hands raw from pushing branches aside. Anxiety mounted. I began to hear voices, or perhaps just the echo of my own footsteps, but nothing human appeared. By late afternoon, I stumbled into a small clearing. There was a faint trail, barely noticeable, but it seemed to lead somewhere. I followed it, hoping it would eventually connect to the road. I had no map, no compass, just the vague memory of the stream near the cabin. Hunger and exhaustion were taking over. I rested in the shade, drinking water from my bottle, trying to regain some strength. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew darker, cooler, and every shadow seemed alive. I realized that if I didn't find the road soon, I would have to spend another night in the forest. Finally, after hours of walking, I saw a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over me, but I also realized how little I had prepared for the journey. The road was uneven, riddled with potholes and hidden roots, but it was something I could follow to civilization. I walked for miles, my legs aching, my back sore, until I finally saw a faint light in the distance. It was a small farmhouse. I approached cautiously, shouting when I thought I saw someone inside. A man appeared at the door, bewildered, but friendly. I explained my situation as best I could, and he offered me a phone to call for help. By nightfall, I was back in town, in a proper bed, safe. The experience stayed with me for months. The feeling of being completely alone, the small noises in the cabin that were almost imperceptible but made the hairs on my arms rise, the realization of how unprepared I had been. I sold the cabin rental almost immediately and never went back. But I kept a small notebook with sketches of the trail, the cabin, the footprints, not as a record of fear, but as a reminder of the raw, unforgiving power of isolation, and how careful one must be when stepping into the wild without preparation. The story ends there, with me returning to my normal life, forever changed. I learned to respect the wilderness, to understand that isolation isn't romantic or peaceful. It is dangerous and unpredictable. And though I told myself I would never go back to a place like that, sometimes late at night, I remember the scratching in the walls and the way the forest seemed to breathe around me, and I shiver at how close I came to being lost for good. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, a week deep in the woods where the air was thick with pine, and the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional call of distant birds. I wanted to disconnect from everything: work, the city, people. My life had become a constant loop of screens, deadlines, and small irritations, and I needed to find a quiet place where I could just exist without anyone else intruding. I found a small, old cabin listed online. It wasn't luxurious, but it had a sturdy feel. The owner's photos showed a simple wooden structure, weathered but solid, surrounded by dense forest, with a small creek running nearby. It looked isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive was long and tense. The further I went from the main roads, the narrower and rougher the path became. At some points, the gravel road turned into uneven dirt, pocked with deep ruts and puddles. The tires of my small hatchback rattled against the rocks and uneven terrain, and I constantly had to slow down to avoid damage. The GPS signal kept dropping in and out, showing only a vague, recalculating icon, which was a little unnerving but also strangely freeing. Eventually, after hours of driving, I turned a corner and the cabin came into view. It was more secluded than I had imagined. There were no other houses in sight, and the surrounding trees pressed close to the edges of the clearing. The creek ran nearby, its gentle burble audible even from the small distance of the driveway. The cabin itself was modest: 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a wood-burning stove. The windows were covered in dust, and the wood of the exterior had darkened from years of exposure. It smelled faintly of mildew, old smoke, and pine, a combination that I found comforting in its honesty. I carried my bags inside, checking to make sure everything was as the listing promised. It was sparsely furnished, just a small bed, a table, a few chairs, but clean enough to settle in for the week. The isolation felt complete, and I immediately understood why people came here to escape the world. The first night passed without incident. I built a fire in the stove, using the wood stacked neatly in a corner, and cooked a simple meal. I slept soundly, the sound of the creek outside lulling me into deep rest. It was only in the middle of the night that I first noticed it, the sound of movement outside. At first, I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush. But then I noticed a heavier, more deliberate crunching footsteps, maybe moving slowly through the leaves. I froze, listening intently, and then it stopped. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. The forest was full of wildlife. I reminded myself that cabins like this were remote, and humans did occasionally pass by, hikers or hunters perhaps. But there was a tension now, a faint sense of being watched, that didn't leave me as I went about collecting water from the creek, chopping wood for the stove, and walking around the clearing. The sun was bright, the sky clear, but a subtle unease had settled over me. I brushed it off as my imagination and focused on practical matters. Stacking firewood, checking the cabin structure, noting the safest paths to the creek. By the second night, the sounds had returned. They weren't constant, but they were deliberate. Footsteps around the cabin, branches snapping, the faint brushing of something against the siding. I started keeping a small hatchet by the bed, a precaution more for my peace of mind than any real expectation of danger. My meals became simpler, my movements slower and more cautious. Each time I stepped outside, I scanned the treeline, trying to spot whatever, or whoever, was moving near the cabin. I kept a mental count. The first night, the sounds were only once or twice. The second night, more frequent. My heart would race every time I heard a noise I couldn't immediately explain. By the third day, my isolation had started to feel suffocating. I moved more slowly, carefully rationing my food and water, checking the woodpile and the cabin's doors and windows. Every shadow seemed suspicious. The forest, which had been beautiful in the daylight, now felt like a living, breathing entity. There was a rhythm to it, a subtle shift that made me feel observed, as if the trees themselves were keeping track of my movements. That evening, I decided to leave the cabin for a short walk along the creek. I carried a small backpack with a flashlight, water, and my hatchet, feeling a creeping tension with every step. The forest seemed darker than it had during the day, the trees casting deep shadows across the narrow path. I followed the creek, the sound of running water oddly comforting, until I reached a bend where the creek opened into a wider pool. Here, I paused, took a deep breath, and tried to calm myself. But then I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate and cautious, coming from the opposite bank of the creek. They weren't rapid, they weren't panicked, they were careful, slow, and measured. I froze, trying to make sense of it. The creek was shallow enough to cross at some points, but I stayed where I was, watching. The footsteps continued along the bank, moving parallel to mine but just out of sight among the trees. My first instinct was to call for help, but my cell phone had no signal, not even the emergency bar. Panic started to creep in. I considered running back to the cabin, but the terrain was uneven, and I didn't want to make noise. Instead, I backed slowly along the creek, trying to keep the sound of my movements minimal. The footsteps followed at the same pace, never accelerating, never stopping. By the time I reached the clearing around the cabin, my heart was racing. I locked all doors and windows, drew the curtains, and sat near the stove with the hatchet in my hands. Every sound outside, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, made me flinch. I spent hours listening, straining to catch any hint of movement. But gradually, exhaustion took over, and I finally fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I discovered something that sent a chill down my spine. Footprints in the mud near the cabin, heavy boots, large, deliberate. They led to the cabin, circled around, and then stopped at the edge of the trees. I could see no further traces, no indication of whether whoever it was had lingered or moved away. I knew then that this wasn't wildlife. Someone had been close enough to touch the cabin, to watch me sleep. Fear settled deep in my chest, but I forced myself to think logically. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture to block doors, nailed planks across the windows, and gathered as many supplies as possible in case I needed to leave quickly. I also started taking stock of ways to escape. If the situation escalated, I would have to make a run for it, but I wanted to know the safest route, the quickest path back to the road. I marked trees along the way, memorized the terrain, and considered hiding places if needed. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. The forest had become a cage, and I was trapped inside. By nightfall, the noises started again. Footsteps around the cabin, faint scratching on the siding, the occasional crack of a branch breaking under weight. I stayed inside, sitting in the corner near the stove, hatchet at the ready. I did not sleep that night. I kept watch, eyes fixed on the windows, ears straining for the slightest sound. I kept telling myself that morning would bring clarity, that the sun would chase away whatever threat lurked in the dark. The following day, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I packed as much as I could carry, keeping the essentials close. I left the cabin, taking my pre-planned route back toward the road. I moved quickly, staying low, avoiding open spaces as much as possible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me flinch. I reached the creek again and crossed it at the shallowest point, remembering the path I had scouted earlier. It was a tense, exhausting journey, but eventually, I reached the gravel road. Relief washed over me, though I remained cautious, scanning the forest edges as I drove. When I finally reached a small town hours later, I stopped at a gas station, called the police, and reported what had happened. They noted my location, promised to check the area, but told me that with the dense forest and lack of witnesses, it was difficult to investigate immediately. Still, the feeling of leaving the isolation behind, of returning to people and signs of normal life was overwhelming. I never returned to that cabin. In the days that followed, I learned that remote cabins were occasionally used by hunters or occasionally people seeking to hide. It was a reminder that isolation has risks, and that even places meant to be peaceful can harbor danger when human threats are involved. I eventually found another cabin for my next trip, closer to the road, with neighbors nearby. The experience had changed the way I thought about solitude. I still valued peace and quiet, but I learned that caution, preparation, and awareness were just as important as the desire to escape. Even now, years later, I remember that cabin vividly. The smell of the wood and the creek, the oppressive quiet, the sound of footsteps outside. I didn't expect much when I drove up the winding dirt road toward the cabin. It was late September, and the trees along the hills were a riot of reds, oranges, and yellows. The forest looked beautiful, almost like a painting, and I could feel the chill in the air, hinting that winter was not far away. I had rented this cabin for the weekend to get away from the city, to leave behind the constant noise of cars, phones, and people. I wanted silence, space, and maybe a little reflection. I did not expect fear. I did not expect danger. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow, nearly invisible path, the tires of my car crunching on a mix of dirt, gravel, and fallen leaves. It was old but well maintained. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sloping gently, with a small chimney that seemed like it had not seen fire in a while. A small porch ran along the front, and I parked beside it, shutting off the engine and letting the silence sink in. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound, your heartbeat, the wind, the creak of the cabin, amplified. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp. Dust lay in corners, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I had packed minimally. A bag with a few changes of clothes, a notebook, and a couple of flashlights. The main room had a small kitchen, a dining table, and a fireplace. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, and I chose the smaller one because it faced the forest. The window gave a perfect view of the trees swaying with the wind, and I liked it. First, it felt serene. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to move things into drawers and closets, folding clothes carefully, arranging my few possessions. Once settled, I wandered to the kitchen to check the cupboards. Canned food, pasta, rice, and a small stack of firewood were all that was inside. I had brought water with me and a bag of apples. Nothing fancy, but enough. I stacked the firewood by the fireplace, thinking I might light a small fire in the evening. As the afternoon faded, the sun dropped low behind the hills, and the forest cast long, twisting shadows across the cabin. I decided to take a walk, to stretch my legs before nightfall. The path behind the cabin was narrow and steep, running into thicker woods. The leaves underfoot were damp and slippery. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I felt good, almost peaceful, until I noticed how quickly the light had diminished. I turned to head back, But the forest seemed different now. The trees loomed, their branches like twisted arms, and every sound, a snap of a twig, a rustle of leaves, felt amplified, alarming. My heartbeat sped up. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just the forest, just nature, nothing else. I kept walking, quicker now, until I finally saw the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. I reached the porch and leaned against the railing, trying to steady my breathing. Night fell fast. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and warming the room. Shadows danced across the walls, but I ignored them, telling myself it was just the fire. I ate a can of beans heated on the stove and washed it down with water. I planned to read a little and then sleep, but before I even opened my book, I heard it. A soft noise outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind. The trees rustled, the branches tapped against the roof. But then, there was something else. A deliberate scrape, like something or someone moving near the walls. I froze. My mind tried to rationalize it. Could be a deer, a raccoon, anything normal. But my instincts screamed that it wasn't normal. I crept to the window and peeked out, trying to see through the dark. Nothing. Just the forest. Just shadows. I tried to calm down, telling myself I was imagining things. I could feel sweat on my forehead. My hands shook slightly. I decided to lock the doors just in case. I checked each one, bolting the main door and the back door, making sure the windows were shut. Hours passed slowly. Every small sound made me jump. The wind, the branches, even the way the fire popped. I tried to sleep, but the sense of being watched kept me awake. Around midnight, I heard it again. A deliberate step on the porch outside. My blood ran cold. Whoever it was, they were quiet, methodical. I couldn't see anything through the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the fire in the fireplace couldn't illuminate the porch. I realized then that I was alone, truly alone. No neighbors, no passing cars, no phone signal for miles. The thought tightened my chest with fear. I grabbed the largest flashlight I had and crept to the back door, trying to listen. The steps stopped. Silence returned. I held my breath, straining to hear, but heard only the usual night sounds of the forest. Maybe it had been nothing, maybe an animal, but deep down I knew it had not been an animal. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear. I stayed inside, lit the fireplace, made coffee, and kept busy cleaning, organizing, and walking around the cabin. I did not go outside. The feeling of being watched persisted, but I told myself it was paranoia. By afternoon, I forced myself to step out onto the porch, surveying the area. Everything seemed normal, the forest peaceful. I tried to enjoy the sun on my face, the crisp air. I decided I would go for a walk, just to reassure myself. I walked carefully, keeping close to the path, glancing around constantly. Everything looked as it should. Then I noticed something. Faint footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They were boot prints, large, heavy, and recent. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen anyone, but someone had been here, right here, while I was inside. I followed the prints a short distance into the woods. They stopped suddenly. No continuation. Nothing. Just the forest reclaiming the earth. Panic set in again. I rushed back to the cabin, locking everything behind me. I felt trapped, cornered, every shadow a potential threat. I stayed inside for the rest of the day, barely moving, barely eating. I kept the fire burning and the doors locked. I considered leaving immediately, but my car was at the bottom of the path, and leaving in the dark on a steep dirt road seemed equally dangerous. Night fell again. I barely slept, dozing off for short intervals only to be woken by every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, the door handle of the back door rattling. I froze, heart thudding. Whoever it was had tried to open the door. My mind raced. I had a small hunting knife in my bag. I grabbed it and hid in the corner of the main room, trembling, listening. The rattling stopped. The silence returned. I stayed in that corner for what felt like hours. The fire burned low, casting weak light across the room. Morning finally came. Exhausted, I dared to peek outside. Nothing. The footprints were gone. No sign of anyone. I debated leaving immediately but knew I needed light and caution to navigate the road safely. I spent the day preparing, checking my car, packing supplies, keeping an eye on the forest. No one appeared, and by evening, I felt it was finally safe enough to leave at first light. The morning drive down the dirt road was tense. Every shadow made me flinch. Every sound startled me, but I kept moving, keeping my eyes on the path. When I reached the main road, I felt an immense wave of relief. I called the local sheriff from my phone as soon as I reached signal, explaining what had happened. They told me they would check the cabin. Weeks later, I learned from the sheriff that someone had been living near the cabin in a hidden clearing. They had been observing visitors for weeks, waiting for an opportunity. The intruder had left the area when the sheriff investigated. The cabin was no longer available for rent after that. I was lucky. I realized just how vulnerable I had been, how close I had come to a dangerous situation. After that trip, I avoided cabins in isolated areas for a long time. I still love nature, but I learned to respect how unpredictable people can be, how isolation can turn a peaceful retreat into a place of fear. I carry that experience with me now, always aware of my surroundings, always cautious, and never underestimating the quiet shadows of a forest. The lesson was clear. Beauty and danger often exist side by side. And sometimes, the most terrifying things are not the ones you imagine, but the ones that hide in plain sight, watching, waiting, silent, until you are alone. It had been months since I had been in the woods, and I had been desperate to get away from everything for a while. The city felt suffocating, with its constant noise, traffic, and endless obligations. I needed silence, I needed space, and I needed to feel some sense of control over my own life again. That's why I decided to rent a small cabin far up in the mountains, a place the maps marked but few people seemed to know. I booked it online, the kind of place that advertised as remote, peaceful, and ideal for those seeking solitude. I thought it would be perfect, and in some ways it was, but I had no idea how much of a test it would turn out to be. I arrived in late afternoon, driving along a gravel road that twisted endlessly through dense pine forests. The smell of wet earth and pine needles was strong, almost sharp in its intensity, and I felt my chest relax as I left the last of the cars behind me. The road narrowed, rocks and roots threatening to damage my tires, and I had to drive slowly, carefully, almost inching forward. There was no cell signal, no radio, no other cars. It was the kind of silence that weighed on you in the beginning but eventually became almost comforting. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the forest floor, painting everything in gold and orange. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, and how perfect the cabin would be for a weekend of complete isolation. When I finally reached it, I realized the description had not exaggerated. The cabin was small, built from rough timber logs, with a stone chimney that looked like it had been used for decades. There was a wooden deck in front, worn from years of use, and a small creek ran nearby, the sound of its water crisp and clear. I parked and stepped out, taking in the smell of wood smoke lingering faintly in the air. There was a stack of firewood neatly arranged, a few pieces of outdoor furniture, and a gravel path that led toward the forest. It looked almost untouched, as if no one had disturbed it in years. I brought in my bags, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The interior was rustic but functional. A small kitchen to the right, a simple table and chairs in the center, and a living space with a stone fireplace and a worn couch. There was a loft upstairs that served as the bedroom, and a small bathroom tucked in the corner. I set my bags down, breathed deeply, and for the first time in weeks, felt like I could truly exhale. That night, I started a fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and popping as I settled into the quiet. I had brought food, water, and supplies for 3 days, thinking that would be enough for a short escape. I spent the evening unpacking, organizing, and making mental notes of the surroundings. Everything seemed perfect, serene, and completely safe. I went to bed early, the darkness outside absolute except for the faint glimmer of the moon through the trees. Sleep came easily at first, a deep, heavy kind of exhaustion that made me forget everything else. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of the wind picking up. At first, it was soft, brushing against the trees and rattling the cabin's windows lightly. I lay there, listening, telling myself it was normal. The forest was alive, always moving, always shifting. But then I heard something else. A thud, faint at first, coming from the direction of the creek. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, a deliberate thump, not random like a falling branch. My heart started racing. I got out of bed quietly, grabbing a flashlight from the nightstand, and slowly walked downstairs. The cabin felt suddenly larger, emptier, as the shadows cast by the fire danced along the walls. I approached the door cautiously, peering outside. The deck was empty. Nothing moved except the trees swaying violently in the wind. I stepped down onto the wooden planks, trying to convince myself it was an animal. Deer or raccoons sometimes came close to cabins. I listened for a moment, but the noise had stopped. I chalked it up to nerves and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I went for a walk along the creek. The water was cold and clear, running over rocks and fallen branches, and I felt better, calmer. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. Footprints. Not human, not exactly. The size was strange, larger than mine, and the pattern uneven. It was possible an animal had wandered close, but the spacing seemed too wide, almost deliberate. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I followed the trail a bit, careful not to go too far from the cabin, but it disappeared after a short distance. I tried not to think about it, telling myself I was imagining things. That night, I heard it again. The thumps, heavier this time, coming from the forest just beyond the creek. I stayed in the cabin, sitting near the fire, flashlight in hand, listening. The sound would stop, then start again, irregular, like someone or something was moving deliberately in the dark. My anxiety grew. I had come here for peace, but the isolation, combined with the strange sounds, made my mind start racing. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked, and for the rest of the night, I sat awake by the fire, listening to the wind, the creek, and the occasional mysterious thump. The third day, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I packed a small backpack with essentials: water, food, flashlight, and a pocket knife. I wanted to explore the area around the cabin in daylight, see if I could find the source of the sounds. The morning was clear, sunlight filtering through the trees, birds chirping, everything seemingly normal. I followed the creek upstream, keeping an eye on the footprints I had seen. They appeared again, fresh this time, leading into a thicker part of the forest. I followed cautiously, every crack of a branch underfoot making my heart jump. After an hour of walking, I found something that made my stomach twist. A small clearing, and in the center, a makeshift camp. Someone had been here recently. There were remnants of a fire, a tattered tarp, and strange markings on the surrounding trees, scratches, deep and deliberate. My mind raced. This wasn't the work of an animal. Someone had been watching the cabin, maybe even staying close by without me knowing. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering, and decided to return to the cabin immediately. The rest of the day was tense. I stayed inside, windows locked, fire going, listening. The thumps came again that night, louder, closer, almost as if whoever had been in the clearing was moving toward the cabin. I felt trapped, isolated, and completely aware that I had no easy way to call for help. My cell signal was non-existent. I didn't want to leave in the dark, but I also didn't feel safe staying. I spent hours thinking, planning. In the early morning, just as the sun started to rise, I decided I would leave. I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything, double-checked locks, and carried my backpack to the car. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so. As I drove along the gravel road, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the winding road, the sunlight beginning to break through the canopy, and the weight slowly lifting from my chest as I drove. By the time I reached a town with cell service, I felt a strange combination of relief and fear. Relief that I had left safely, fear at the thought of what could have been if I had stayed another night. I reported the makeshift camp and markings to the local ranger station, but there was little they could do. The area was remote, and it was impossible to patrol constantly. They suggested I had been lucky and that sometimes people would stay hidden near cabins for days without being noticed. I realized then that I had indeed been lucky, that being in the right place at the right time and trusting my instincts had probably saved me from something I couldn't fully imagine. After that trip, I never returned to the cabin. I didn't try to push my luck again in the remote wilderness. But I think about it often, the silence of the forest, the sudden noises in the night, and the knowledge that someone had been there, close enough to observe, close enough to be dangerous. It changed the way I see isolation and solitude, and it taught me to respect the thin line between safety and danger in the wild. I realized that peace comes not just from solitude, but from awareness, preparation, and sometimes the willingness to leave when things feel wrong. Looking back, I can see the entire experience as a lesson in vigilance and survival. The cabin, the forest, the strange presence. Everything combined to push me to my limits, to test how far I could trust my instincts and remain calm under pressure. By leaving when I did, I avoided what could have been a very real threat, and I carried with me a new understanding of caution, observation, and self-preservation. It was a frightening experience, but it ended with clarity, safety, and a deeper respect for the wilderness and the unknown presence that had shadowed my stay. The memory remains vivid. I remember the smell of the pine, the cold water of the creek, the way the shadows moved under the trees, the sound of distant thumps echoing through the night. I had been driving for hours, the gravel crunching under my tires and the smell of wet pine hanging thick in the air. The road was narrow, winding between dense clusters of spruce and cedar, the kind of trees that block sunlight so completely that even midday can feel like evening. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat in a cabin I had rented miles from the nearest town, miles from anyone. It was supposed to be a weekend of quiet, of being alone with the cold, clean air and the sound of my own breathing. But I didn't realize how quickly that isolation could become suffocating, how it could change the way you perceive the smallest sounds and shadows. The cabin was at the end of a long, rutted path that seemed barely wide enough for my small car. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, slanting through the trees in long golden stripes that made the forest look almost magical. The cabin itself was small, wooden, built in a rough, rustic style. It wasn't fancy. There was a stone chimney, darkened with years of soot, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. But it looked solid, and that's what I needed. A place I could lock myself into and disappear from the world for a few days. I parked and stepped out. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of damp earth and moss. I carried my backpack to the porch and paused for a moment, listening. There was nothing except the occasional creak of a branch and the distant call of a bird. Even though it was beautiful, the silence was almost too complete, and a strange prickle ran down my spine. I shook it off. I had been alone in remote places before. I could handle this. The door was heavy and swung open with a groan. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. There was a small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with the basics, a sink, a stovetop, a fridge that hummed quietly, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. A single bedroom was tucked beneath the eaves. I set down my bag and did a quick check. Everything seemed intact. Nothing was broken or out of place. That was when I first noticed it. The windows. They were clean, but the glass was thick, slightly wavy in the way old glass often is, and it reflected the light oddly. I didn't think much of it at the time. After settling in, I unpacked my supplies. I had brought food, water, a few books, and some camping gear for the hike I planned the next day. I made myself a simple dinner on the stovetop, pasta with a Jared sauce, and ate it at the small wooden table, my chair creaking under the weight. The cabin felt warmer than outside, but I could hear the wind through the cracks in the wooden walls, a constant reminder that I was miles from anywhere, completely alone. Night came quickly, Without the lights of the town or passing cars, darkness pressed in, dense and complete. I lit a single lamp and moved to the window, curious to see the forest under the moonlight. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, almost solid, and I realized I had never noticed how many branches and hollows existed just a few dozen feet from the cabin. It made me feel small in a way I wasn't used to. That first night, I slept poorly. The unfamiliar sounds of the forest were everywhere. Rustling, snapping twigs, the distant howl of some animal I couldn't identify. I woke several times, my heart racing, convinced I had heard someone walking outside, only to find nothing. In the morning, I tried to convince myself it had been the wind or deer moving through the underbrush. But the tension lingered, a quiet dread that didn't go away even in the bright light of day. I spent the next morning hiking, following a trail that was supposed to loop through the woods and return to the cabin. The trail was narrow and uneven, the roots and stones threatening to trip me at every step. It was beautiful, more so than I had expected, but I kept noticing things that made me uneasy. The way the trees seemed unnaturally spaced, the abrupt gaps in the underbrush, and the occasional pile of stones that looked like they had been stacked deliberately. I told myself I was imagining things. People do that in the forest, they see patterns that aren't there. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was tired and thirsty. The sun was dipping low again, casting long shadows that made the forest feel like it was closing in on the cabin. I lit a fire in the fireplace to warm the room, the flames dancing and throwing jagged shadows across the walls. I could hear something outside, faint at first, a scraping sound against the wooden siding of the cabin. My stomach tightened. Could be a branch or a deer or a raccoon. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but then the sound repeated, deliberate, slow, moving along the side of the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I strained my eyes, peering into the darkness outside the window. Nothing, just the trees, motionless, and the black space between them. I told myself to calm down, that I was alone and nothing was outside. But the feeling didn't go away. Something about the way the silence had returned was wrong, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The next hours were the worst. Every small sound, a snap, a rustle, the distant echo of a branch, made my heart jump. I double-checked the locks, moved furniture near the doors, and kept a kitchen knife close by. I tried to keep busy, reading and cleaning the cabin, but the unease didn't leave me. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the room, and even the reflection in the window looked different, somehow darker than it should have been. Then, at about midnight, I heard it again, outside, this time unmistakably. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart raced. I crouched low, pressing myself against the wall, gripping the knife. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear each step clearly, like something was pacing just out of sight. Time stretched, the minutes crawling by. I wanted to call the police, but there was no cell signal, no way to reach anyone. I was completely isolated. I spent the rest of the night in the corner, listening. The footsteps never came closer to the door, never broke the pattern, but they didn't leave either. Morning light was a relief, but the tension didn't vanish. Outside, the forest looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But when I went to check the perimeter, I found footprints. Large, muddy, circling the cabin, stopping at every window. Whoever had done this had been careful, methodical, and they had been watching. I packed quickly, deciding to leave that day. The hike I had planned now seemed unimportant. I started the car and drove down the gravel path, constantly checking the rearview mirror. Halfway down the road, I saw movement in the trees, figures disappearing behind the trunks as I passed. My hands shook as I drove. I didn't stop until I reached a town and could finally call the police. The officers told me the area had a history of break-ins, of people living off the grid nearby, watching isolated cabins for days. No one had been caught, but they warned me never to go alone in such a remote place again. I learned later that the footprints around my cabin were made by someone who had been camping nearby for weeks, observing anyone who came to the cabin. They had been ready, waiting. It was terrifying, the realization that my sense of safety had been an illusion. that someone had been watching my every move without me noticing. But I survived, and eventually the memory became less sharp. I still feel the tension sometimes when I hear a branch snap in a quiet place, or when I'm alone in a dark room, but I know now the forest doesn't have to be supernatural to be dangerous. People are enough. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The idea of escaping the constant noise of the city, the endless traffic, the insistent blare of alarms and sirens, and the ceaseless demands of work had been consuming my thoughts for weeks. The cabin I had rented was tucked deep into a stretch of forestland, far enough away from any road to guarantee silence, close enough that I could drive there without spending hours navigating backcountry trails. When I finally pulled into the gravel drive, the engine of my car humming low in the stillness, I felt a heavy, unfamiliar sense of relief settle into my chest. The trees loomed around me, dense and imposing, their leaves whispering faintly in a breeze that carried the sharp smell of pine and damp earth. I could already tell the air would feel different here, cleaner, more tangible. I stepped out of the car and the gravel crunched under my boots. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, simple and functional, made of dark timber that had weathered to a muted brown over the years. The windows were small and set high, preventing any casual glance inside. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting that it had been used recently, perhaps by the caretaker or the previous renter. The first thing I did was survey the exterior, walking the perimeter slowly. The clearing extended a few dozen feet from the cabin before giving way to dense forest, trees so thick that even in the late afternoon, shadows pooled between them like ink stains. The air was thick with a combination of pine, wet leaves, and the faint iron scent of damp soil. Somewhere close, a stream must have been flowing, although I couldn't see it yet. I noted the firewood stacked neatly against the side of the cabin, the small shed where I assumed tools or spare supplies were kept, and the slight tilt of the porch, which sagged under years of use but seemed stable enough. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and dust, a combination that was strangely comforting. I dropped my bags near the door and took a slow, deliberate walk through each room. The living area had a stone fireplace, its interior blackened from previous fires. The furniture was sparse but functional. A worn sofa, a small table, a few chairs. The kitchen had a stove, a fridge, and a sink, all of them clean but clearly aged. Cabinets held a handful of pots and utensils, enough for basic cooking. I ran my hand over the wood surfaces, feeling their rough texture, noting the faint cracks that marred the older wood, the knots that made the floorboards uneven in places. Upstairs, there were 2 bedrooms with modest beds, thin mattresses, and heavy blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs. I didn't unpack much. I wanted to get comfortable enough to settle in but not burden myself with unnecessary fuss. The first night was deceptively calm. I started a fire in the fireplace, stacking the wood carefully, lighting it with matches that I had brought along. The flames took quickly, casting a warm glow across the cabin. Outside, the darkness felt thick and absolute, pressing against the walls with a kind of quiet intensity that I wasn't used to. I went to bed early, lying beneath the blankets and listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere beyond the clearing. The sounds felt distant yet sharply defined, like they existed just beyond a thin veil separating me from the forest. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the constant awareness that I was entirely alone, with no one for miles around. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the narrow windows. The air inside the cabin was cool and smelled faintly of wood smoke from the fire the night before. I brewed coffee over the small stove, the smell filling the room and mixing with the faint odor of damp wood. After breakfast, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I had a map of the property and the nearby trails, but much of it was unmarked, trails created more by animals and the occasional hiker than by careful planning. The first trail led to the stream I had sensed the previous day, its water clear and cold, tumbling over rocks in small, sharp-edged ripples. I spent the morning walking along its bank, noting the variety of trees, the small animals that darted away when I approached, and the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating patterns that danced across the ground. It was peaceful, beautiful even, but there was an underlying tension I couldn't shake. The forest felt alive in a way that was almost tangible, each sound amplified by the stillness, each movement heightened by isolation. By the third day, the initial calm had begun to erode. I noticed small things that made my stomach tighten, subtle inconsistencies in the environment. Footprints appeared where there had been none before, shallow and partially obscured by leaves, but distinct enough to recognize. I convinced myself they were from deer or other wildlife, but the spacing and shape sometimes seemed wrong, almost deliberate. At night, the sounds of the forest grew sharper, more insistent. Branches scratched against the walls in ways that didn't align with the wind. Distant thuds echoed with no apparent source. I had expected to hear animals, perhaps the occasional bear or coyote, but the intensity of the noises felt unnatural, almost like someone, or something, was moving deliberately outside. Each night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, walked the perimeter with a flashlight, and listened for anything that might indicate an actual threat. But nothing conclusive ever appeared. It was the ambiguity that gnawed at me, the not knowing. One afternoon, while collecting firewood, I noticed a series of marks along the tree trunks near the edge of the clearing. Deep scratches, as if something had tried to climb or claw its way upward. They weren't like the normal signs of animals. I was familiar with deer, bear, and even raccoon markings, and the depth of the cuts suggested something larger, heavier, and stronger. My pulse quickened as I traced the scratches, following their trail into the forest. The underbrush grew denser, branches catching on my clothes and scratching my skin. I stopped short when I heard a low, deliberate cracking sound behind me, the unmistakable noise of someone or something stepping through undergrowth. My heart raced. I didn't turn around, afraid of what I might see, and I retreated quickly to the cabin, the smell of fear sharp in my nostrils. Over the next 2 days, I became increasingly vigilant. I reinforced the doors with spare pieces of wood, created small noise traps near the cabin's perimeter with tin cans and string, anything to give me early warning of movement outside. I slept with a flashlight at my side and a heavy stick within reach. The sounds didn't relent. Branches snapped in the dark, leaves rustled as if brushed by invisible hands, and the occasional thud reverberated through the forest with no identifiable source. I avoided venturing far from the cabin, sticking mostly to the immediate clearing, wary of the unknown that awaited deeper in the woods. By the 5th day, my mental state had begun to fray. The constant vigilance, the isolation, and the persistent sense of being watched wore on me. My food supply was limited, and I rationed carefully, unwilling to risk trips to the car or beyond the immediate vicinity. My nights became a torment of anxious listening, every sound amplified into a potential threat. I could feel the tension in my muscles, the shallow, fast rhythm of my breathing, the sticky sweat on my skin even in the cool air of the cabin. Then, on the 6th day, the situation escalated. I awoke to the sound of footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate, distinct against the wooden planks. My stomach dropped. I had secured the doors as best I could, but the sound persisted, slow, measured, and close. I grabbed the stick and edged toward the window, peering out cautiously. The clearing was empty. Nothing moved, no sign of life. And yet, the sounds continued, now accompanied by faint scratching, like fingernails raking across wood. My pulse spiked. I realized that the cabin itself was no longer a sanctuary but a trap, a place that could be observed and approached without my ability to detect it. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to think rationally. I considered every possible scenario, every possible source of the noise. Could it be an animal? The sounds didn't match anything I had heard before. A human? That was far more dangerous. Someone might have been stalking the cabin, observing me, waiting for an opportunity. I checked the emergency supplies I had brought. Matches, a flashlight, a small knife, some food and water, my cell phone, which had a weak but functional signal. I decided my only course of action was to leave, to get back to the main road and alert the authorities if necessary. Packing quietly, I moved as efficiently as I could. Every step was deliberate, careful not to make noise that might betray my presence. The moment I stepped outside, the forest seemed to close in around me. Shadows stretched unnaturally, the trees leaning in the dim light of dawn. I moved toward my car with a precision born of fear, my eyes darting constantly to the underbrush, scanning for any sign of movement. The gravel crunched underfoot, betraying my presence far more than I wanted. But I didn't stop. I had to keep moving. I had been driving for most of the day, the sun climbing higher in the sky as I passed through endless stretches of forest. The air outside my truck was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, and though I had planned this cabin trip to be peaceful, I already felt a strange, uneasy sense settling over me. The map on my phone had long since lost service, and the narrow dirt road I was following seemed to stretch forever, curving sharply between dense groves of trees. I had only packed the essentials: food for a few days, a small first aid kit, my flashlight, a set of extra batteries, and a heavy-duty camping knife I liked to keep close by. I had picked this cabin randomly from a website listing remote rentals, wanting solitude and a break from the city. But as I drove, I wondered if I had underestimated just how isolated remote could be. The cabin itself appeared almost suddenly, a small wooden structure tucked in a clearing. It had no porch, no deck, just a single door and a couple of small windows that reflected the sunlight in sharp glints. It looked sturdy enough, made of thick logs that had darkened with age. A thin plume of smoke rose from a stone chimney, which suggested someone had been here recently. I parked my truck on the uneven dirt patch outside and stepped down, feeling the ground sink slightly under my boots. The air was heavy and quiet, not a breeze in sight. I carried my pack to the front door and noticed the lock was a simple latch, not very secure, but for a place like this, it seemed sufficient. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly musty, like old blankets or damp fabric. It was small but functional. A kitchenette occupied one corner with a tiny stove and a sink, and a table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. There was a loft above, accessible by a narrow ladder, and I assumed that was where the bed was. The walls were bare except for a few hooks, and the windows had no curtains, letting in the light but also making the place feel exposed. I put my things down, checked the flashlight and knife, and decided to explore the surrounding area before it got dark. The forest around the cabin was thick, the trees tall and crowded together, their roots tangled across the ground. I walked slowly, stepping over rocks and fallen branches, my senses alert to every sound. Birds called occasionally, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the normal forest noises seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of my own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. I noticed the remnants of old fire pits, half buried in leaves, and traces of trails that had been worn into the earth, probably from people or animals passing through long ago. I made a mental note of the nearest trees I could use for shelter or climbing, just in case, and headed back to the cabin before the sun started to dip behind the trees. Night came quickly, faster than I expected, and the cabin suddenly felt smaller and more confining. I lit a lantern I found on a shelf and set it on the table, the flickering light casting long shadows across the walls. The forest outside was completely dark now, and I could hear the wind picking up slightly, moving through the branches. At first, it was just the usual creaking and rustling, but soon there were other sounds. Low, crunching steps in the underbrush, soft thumps that seemed too heavy to be just falling branches. I tried to convince myself it was just deer or raccoons, but the timing and rhythm felt deliberate, almost like something was circling the cabin. My stomach tightened. I checked the windows and doors. Everything was closed and latched, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to make a small fire in the fireplace, hoping the warm light and the noise of crackling wood would make the cabin feel safer. I gathered some dry kindling and logs, and as the flames caught, I sat near the fire and tried to calm my racing mind. The shadows danced across the walls, and I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a figure standing outside. The steps in the forest continued intermittently, sometimes close, sometimes further away. I checked my phone again, but there was still no signal. I tried to focus on the sounds of the fire, the the smell of burning wood, anything to ground myself in reality. Around midnight, I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was the distinct creak of the cabin door, just slightly, as if someone was testing the latch. I didn't move at first, listening carefully. The wind outside made the sound blend in at first, but then I realized it was deliberate. Someone was outside. My heart started pounding, and I quietly reached for the knife, sliding it into my jacket pocket. I thought about the truck, the keys I had left inside, and the tiny chance I could drive away if needed. But the dirt road was long and winding, and in the dark, I could easily get stuck or lost. I decided to wait and watch, pressing myself against the wall opposite the door. The footsteps circled once, slow and deliberate, then stopped. The door creaked again, and a shadow fell across the frosted glass. I held my breath, trying to stay calm. I considered shouting or making noise, but if it was someone dangerous, that might provoke them. Instead, I watched the shadow move and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the steps retreated, fading into the distance. I didn't breathe fully until I heard nothing at all. The next day, I barely slept, dozing fitfully near the fire. I made a plan. I would stay inside as much as possible and only go outside in daylight. I scavenged the cabin for anything that could serve as a weapon or protection. More logs for the fireplace, heavy kitchen tools, and the spare blanket I could use to make a barricade at the door. I also prepared a small pack with food, water, and essentials in case I needed to leave quickly. As the sun rose, I ventured outside briefly, circling the cabin and scanning the forest. Nothing seemed out of place, but the underbrush showed signs of recent movement. Footprints, broken branches, and flattened grass. Someone had been there, and I knew they could come back. The days blurred together, each one filled with the constant tension of waiting, watching, and preparing. I avoided unnecessary trips outside and kept the fire going at night. I started noticing small things I hadn't before. The way the wind shifted through certain trees, the way the forest floor held impressions of recent activity, even the occasional glint of metal among the leaves that could have been a discarded tool or weapon. My mind ran through every possible scenario, every way I could escape or defend myself. On the third night, it happened again. The steps approached the cabin, slower this time, almost methodical. I hid near the loft ladder, gripping the knife and listening. There was a pause, then a scraping sound against the doorframe, as if someone had tried the latch again. I tensed, ready to strike if needed. Then I heard a low voice whisper my name. My blood ran cold. I hadn't told anyone exactly where I was staying. Whoever this was had been watching closely. I made a decision. I couldn't wait here any longer. I had to leave, even if it meant risking the dirt roads at night. I waited for the footsteps to retreat, then packed my essentials quickly, securing what I could in my truck. I left the cabin as quietly as possible and started driving slowly down the narrow road, the engine's hum and headlights cutting through the dark. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. Hours passed, the forest stretching endlessly around me, until finally the road widened, and I reached a small highway. Relief washed over me as I stopped at the first gas station I found. I called the local police and reported the cabin, the footprints, the disturbances, and the fact that someone had clearly been observing the place. They told me they would investigate and that I should stay somewhere safe. I drove to a motel in town, exhausted but grateful to be away from that cabin. Over the next few days, I learned that the cabin had been used by a group of people for illegal activities, burglary, storage of stolen goods, and worse. My instincts had been right. The footsteps, the sounds, the way I felt watched, it had all been real. I returned home slowly, shaken but wiser. I realized the importance of being prepared, trusting instincts, and not underestimating isolation. I never went back to that part of the forest, and I never rented a remote cabin without checking the surrounding area thoroughly. The memory of those nights, the fear and tension, stayed with me, but it also reminded me of my own resilience, of the careful steps I took to protect myself and ultimately escape unharmed. I learned to respect the forest, its silence, and its hidden dangers, and I never again sought solitude without understanding the risks completely. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It wasn't a trip anyone would call glamorous or exciting, and I had no friends joining me. No planned adventures beyond hiking trails and the occasional fishing spot. I wanted isolation, silence, and space to think. Work had been suffocating for the last year, and my life in the city felt like a constant noise, a blur of office lights, car horns, and other people's problems. I found a small cabin deep in the forest through a local listing. The cabin was older, rustic, and the kind of place that had clearly been built more for utility than comfort. It wasn't modern, but that was part of its appeal. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure with a stone chimney, a few small windows, and a dirt road leading to it. There were no neighbors for miles, no internet access, and no mobile signal. Exactly what I wanted. The drive out was long, longer than I expected. The map had shown a paved road turning into a gravel path, but the gravel became dirt, the dirt became mud, and at some points, fallen branches blocked the way. I had to stop and move some myself. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, casting a warm orange light over the trees. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The air was cool and smelled of damp leaves and pine needles, the way forest air always does after a long, dry summer. I parked the car on the uneven ground near the cabin and climbed out. The tires had left deep marks in the soft soil, and I had to step carefully over stones and roots. The silence was immediate and heavy, broken only by distant birds, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional crack of a twig under some unseen animal's foot. The cabin looked sturdier than I expected. Its wood was weathered, grayish-brown with streaks of black where rain had soaked through over the years. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and moss clung to some of the shingles. The door was heavy, solid wood with a simple metal latch. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and faint smoke. There were no signs of anyone currently living there, just remnants of previous visitors. A worn rug, a small stack of firewood in the corner, and a kettle on a rusty stove. The windows were dusty, but not broken. The light from outside slanted in through the dirty glass, casting long, thin shadows that shifted as the sun moved. I set my bag down and began to explore. There was a small kitchen area, a living space with a low table and a couple of chairs, a bedroom with a single bed, and a loft above that seemed usable but cramped. Everything was functional, nothing fancy. I liked that about it. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed and opened the small cooler I had brought, unpacking food for the next few days. I had enough for a week, though I hadn't planned to stay that long. I wanted 3 nights, at most, maybe 4 if I felt like it. The first night was quiet as anyone could expect in a forest. I lit a small fire in the stove, the flames crackling and dancing against the walls. I sat back, drinking water and staring into the flames, feeling the tension from city life slowly fade. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with soft moans and rustling, and occasionally a bird or animal would stir, but nothing seemed particularly threatening. The sky darkened, and stars appeared, bright and sharp. The isolation was peaceful, almost meditative. But the second night, things began to feel different. I had spent the day hiking a nearby trail. The path was narrow and overgrown in places, the soil damp from a recent rain, with patches of slippery moss on rocks. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, watching minnows dart through the water and the way the sunlight refracted off the ripples. I returned to the cabin tired, muddy, and covered in insect bites, but satisfied. As night fell, I began preparing dinner and noticed something odd. One of the windows had condensation on the inside, unusual since the cabin was cold and I had barely opened the stove. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the air settling, but then I noticed small, faint scratches in the dirt on the windowsill. They were irregular, not deep, just marks, like claws had dragged lightly across the wood. I frowned. I live in the city. I've seen stray cats, squirrels, and raccoons, but this seemed different. Nothing could climb that high from the outside easily. The forest was dense, but there were no trees close enough to the window. I dismissed it for the night, telling myself I was tired and imagining things. I locked the door, double-checked it, and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even the distant call of an owl, felt magnified. My mind kept running through possibilities. Animal, human, wind. I stayed awake for hours, listening, tense, staring at the shadows moving across the walls. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep, light and restless. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was mine, part of a dream, but then I realized it wasn't. The breathing was outside, slow, deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing. I froze. The cabin was old but solid. I had locked the doors, closed the windows. Whoever or whatever it was outside. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see, but my curiosity got the better of me. I slowly approached the window and peered out. First, I saw nothing. The trees swayed in the wind. Then I noticed the shadow. Tall, slightly hunched, moving just beyond the tree line, always out of clear sight. My heart raced, and I backed away from the window, considering my options. I had a small axe by the stove, the kind used to chop firewood. I grabbed it and sat in the corner, listening. The breathing continued, intermittent, patient. I couldn't see much, couldn't tell if it was human, an animal, or someone hiding, waiting. Hours passed. The shadow never came closer, never fully revealed itself. I stayed inside, only stepping out briefly to check the perimeter, finding no footprints, no signs of entry, nothing except broken twigs and flattened grass where it seemed someone had been moving around. I realized the figure was probably watching me, studying me as I studied it. The feeling of being hunted, of not being alone, pressed on me in a way the forest never had before. By the third day, I knew I couldn't leave through the normal road. It was muddy, narrow, and if anyone was outside, I would be vulnerable. I decided to hike through the forest instead, back toward the main road. I packed quickly, taking only essentials. Every rustle and movement set my nerves on edge. I stayed low, moved slowly, and kept my axe ready. The hike was grueling. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick, branches scratching my arms, roots threatening to trip me. I constantly checked behind me, seeing glimpses of movement that could be shadows, animals, or the same figure. I didn't stop for water until I reached the stream I had found earlier. I drank cautiously, scanning the surroundings. I noticed something then. Footprints, human, large, muddied, following the stream in the same direction I was heading. Panic set in. Whoever it was, they had tracked me. I made my way through the forest for hours, following the stream because it led downhill and eventually to the road. My legs were aching, my arms scratched, my clothes torn in places from thorns and branches. But the thought of being caught pushed me forward. The forest was no longer peaceful. Every sound was a threat. I stumbled multiple times, fell into shallow ditches, but kept going, adrenaline carrying me further. Finally, late afternoon, I broke through the trees onto the dirt road. I ran, slipping in mud, my clothes soaked in sweat and rainwater. I could see a car passing in the distance, headlights cutting through the early dusk. I waved frantically, screaming, hoping they could see me. The car slowed, turned, and I ran toward it, collapsing near the passenger side. The driver was startled but helped me in, asking if I was okay. I was shaking, barely able to explain, pointing vaguely toward the forest. They nodded, understanding more than I could articulate, and drove me toward the nearest town. By the time I reached the town, I was physically exhausted but safe. The police were called to check the cabin. They found no one, no signs of forced entry, but they did find evidence of someone having been there recently. Footprints in the mud, scratch marks on the windows, and small items left behind, possibly dropped in a hurry. No one was ever caught, and the forest remained as silent as it had been before my trip. But I never went back. The experience changed me. I realized how quickly peace can turn into fear, how quickly isolation can make you vulnerable, and how important it is to respect the unknown. I had sought solitude to escape life, but in that forest, I found that solitude can be dangerous, that being alone can make you visible to eyes you never wanted to see you. I never returned. I had been driving for hours on narrow, winding roads that cut through the dense forest like veins through dark green flesh. The sun was sinking low in the sky, casting long, thin shadows between the trees, turning everything a deep, muted orange. I had rented a small cabin for a weekend getaway, a place isolated enough that my phone barely got a signal, a spot that promised silence, solitude, and a chance to escape the constant noise of the city. I had imagined sitting on the porch, reading a book, watching the forest around me, and the occasional deer crossing the path. But reality quickly reminded me that isolation had a different kind of weight when the day was ending and the forest around me seemed alive with subtle, almost imperceptible movements. The cabin itself was tucked at the end of a dirt road that looked more like a trail than a road. It was modest, made entirely of aged wood, with a small porch out front and a sloping roof that seemed too heavy for its frame. There was a thin layer of dust on the windows, a sign that it hadn't been used heavily, and the smell of damp earth mixed with old pine hit me as I stepped inside. Everything was silent except for the faint creaking of the wooden floor beneath my boots. The air felt cooler inside, and the dim light from the setting sun spilled in through the windows, painting everything in a subdued orange glow. I set down my bag and began exploring, trying to familiarize myself with the cabin before night fully fell. The interior was simple but functional. A small kitchen with a stove and a sink, a table with 2 chairs, a living area with a rickety couch, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom with a single bed, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. There was a stack of firewood by the door, a few canned goods left in the kitchen, and a lantern sitting on the table. The first thing I did was open the windows to air the place out. Then I turned my attention to the wood stove, trying to see if it still worked. The glass was cracked, and the metal felt cold, but it seemed usable. I decided I would start a fire before nightfall. Outside, the sun disappeared entirely, leaving a sky washed in deep blue with streaks of fading orange on the horizon. The forest around the cabin grew darker, and the sounds of the evening began. The distant call of birds, the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, the occasional crack of a branch falling somewhere beyond sight. I lit the lantern and set it on the table, its flickering light casting moving shadows across the walls. I could feel a tension in the air, something that isn't there in the day when the forest looks harmless. At night, the trees loom and shift, their branches like reaching fingers, and the slightest sound makes your heart jump. I went to the stove, stacked some wood, and tried to light a fire. It took a few attempts, coughing up smoke and leaving soot on my hands before the first flames caught. Watching the fire grow, I felt a small sense of security. There is something about a fire in a cabin, in the middle of nowhere, that brings a fragile sense of control. I sat on the couch, letting the warmth wash over me, and began to take stock of my supplies. There was food, water, and basic tools, but I realized I had brought only a minimal first aid kit. The nearest town was at least 30 minutes away by car, and the road there would be nearly impossible if it rained. Around 9, I went to bed early. The fire crackled softly, the shadows on the walls dancing as if they were alive. I had pulled the blankets over me and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the house, every small movement outside made me tense. I told myself it was the wind, the animals, the natural sounds of the forest, but the feeling didn't leave. Eventually, I drifted in and out of sleep, waking periodically to the darkness outside. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the window, but when I looked closely, it was only the branches swaying. Still, my heart raced. The next morning, I woke to a thick fog that had rolled in overnight. The forest around the cabin was nearly invisible, trees dissolving into a white-gray haze. It was beautiful in a strange, eerie way, but it also made the cabin feel even more isolated. I brewed coffee over the small stove and decided to explore the area around the cabin, keeping the fog in mind. The dirt path I had driven in on was slick from dew, the ground soft and uneven. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the fog absorbed all the usual sounds. I walked carefully, my eyes scanning every shadow, every movement. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. The fog made it impossible to tell direction accurately, and landmarks disappeared as soon as I turned my head. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path seemed unfamiliar now. Panic began to set in. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was none. The forest seemed to close in, the trees tall and oppressive, the ground soft with fallen leaves. I tried shouting, listening for an echo, but my voice felt swallowed by the mist. Hours passed. The sun began to set again, though through the fog it was barely visible, a pale glow in the sky. I realized I had no choice but to spend the night in the forest. I looked for a suitable spot to rest, somewhere elevated, dry, and with some visibility of the surrounding area. I found a small rise with thick undergrowth that could block wind, gathered dry leaves for insulation, and huddled there, trying to stay warm. The sounds of the forest intensified at night. The rustling of branches, the movement of small animals, the occasional distant howl of a coyote. Each sound made me flinch. In the night, I heard something different. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, too heavy for an animal. My heart stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps circled, never coming closer, never leaving entirely. I didn't dare move. I told myself it was likely another hiker, but the forest was so isolated that it felt impossible. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I knew moving blindly could be worse. I stayed crouched in the undergrowth, clutching a thick branch as a makeshift weapon, listening until the sounds faded. Sleep didn't come again that night. When morning came, the fog had lifted, and the forest looked less menacing, though the memory of the night's terror lingered. I cautiously made my way back toward the direction I believed the cabin was, marking trees with scratches in case I needed to backtrack. Hours passed, my legs and arms sore from moving through dense undergrowth, my lungs burning from exertion. Finally, in the late afternoon, I saw the familiar outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me in a wave I could almost physically feel. Back in the cabin, I checked all the locks, secured the doors and windows, and gathered more firewood than I thought I'd need. I realized how vulnerable I had been, how little prepared I was for even a few hours of being lost. I decided to stay put the next day, resting and preparing for a careful hike back to civilization. I rationed my food, made more water over the stove, and organized my supplies, making sure everything was within reach. Each sound outside, each rustle of leaves, made my senses heighten. I slept lightly, fire burning in the stove to provide warmth and some sense of security. The following morning, I woke early and began the hike back to the main road, careful to stay on paths I could recognize. The forest, though still dense, felt less threatening in daylight. I kept track of landmarks, avoided areas with dense undergrowth, and moved steadily, though slowly. After several hours, I finally reached the dirt road and eventually the paved road leading toward the town. Exhausted, dehydrated, and sore, I drove slowly, grateful for the civilization I had almost taken for granted. Back in my apartment later that evening, I reflected on the weekend. The cabin had promised solitude and peace, but it had also reminded me of how fragile safety can be in the wilderness. The fear, the uncertainty, and the raw vulnerability I had felt were unforgettable. I realized I had underestimated the forest, overestimated my preparedness, and assumed isolation was easy when in reality it demanded respect and caution. I started preparing a more comprehensive emergency kit, learning basic survival skills, and researching wilderness navigation. The experience, terrifying as it had been, left me more aware, more cautious, and more grateful for the safety of everyday life. I never returned to that cabin. The road, the fog, the isolation, the footsteps. I could still feel the tension in my chest whenever I thought about it. But I also carried with me the knowledge that survival depended on preparation, awareness, and keeping calm in situations where fear threatens to take over. It had been a scare, a real one, but it ended safely because I managed to keep control, adapt, and eventually find my way back. The forest had not harmed me. It had tested me, and I had survived, though not without cost. Every detail, every shadow, every sound stayed with me. A vivid reminder that the wilderness, beautiful and serene in daylight, I had always wanted to escape the city for a few days, to be completely alone in the woods, away from the constant noise, the bright lights, and the ever-present pressure of deadlines and obligations. When I found the small cabin listed online, tucked away in a remote part of the mountains, I felt like it was exactly what I needed. The pictures showed a modest wooden structure with a small porch, surrounded by dense forest. No neighbors, no roads directly leading to it, just the raw, untouched wilderness. I rented it for a weekend, telling myself it would be peaceful, a chance to clear my mind. The drive there was longer than I expected. The paved road eventually gave way to gravel, then dirt, and finally, a narrow track that twisted between thick clusters of trees. My old sedan struggled over some of the larger ruts, and the branches scraped along the sides. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, spilling orange light through the tall pines. The cabin looked smaller in person than it had online, worn by time and weather, but the rustic charm was undeniable. The air was cooler here, scented with pine and damp earth, and for a moment, I felt a deep sense of relief wash over me. I parked in the small clearing in front of the cabin and got out. The forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No birds singing, no rustling of small animals, just a soft wind whispering through the leaves. I carried my bag to the porch, noticing the faded paint on the railing and the uneven boards under my feet. The door opened easily, revealing a small room with a low ceiling, a wood stove in the corner, and a handful of basic furnishings. A small kitchen area with a sink and a propane stove occupied one side, and a narrow staircase led to a loft with a simple bed. The place smelled faintly of dust and old wood. I set my bag down and walked through each room, trying to convince myself that being alone here would be safe and comforting. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, checking that my phone had signal. It barely did, just enough for texts and a weak 4G signal that came and went. The thought made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as part of being in such a remote area. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove, appreciating the quiet crackle of the fire as it caught. Outside, the forest darkened rapidly. Shadows stretched between the trees, long and sharp. I thought I saw movement at the edge of my vision, but each time I looked directly, there was nothing there, just trees. I shook my head and tried to relax, telling myself it was fatigue and the dim light playing tricks on me. Night came quickly. I made a small dinner, ate it at the tiny table by the window, and then started a fire in the stove to keep warm. The temperature dropped sharply, and I realized how exposed I was out here. The cabin was basic, single-pane windows, thin walls, and while it kept the wind out, every sound from outside seemed louder than it should have been. A branch cracked nearby, sharp and sudden, and I jumped. My heart thumped in my chest as I strained my eyes into the darkness. Still, there was nothing but the endless tangle of trees. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth and light it provided, but the sense of being watched lingered. Sleep was fitful. Every snap of a branch, every distant thump of falling debris made me startle. I woke repeatedly, straining to hear anything unusual, feeling the weight of isolation pressing in. Around midnight, I heard a sound I couldn't ignore. A scraping, like nails or claws dragging across wood, came from outside. I froze, listening. The wind had been calm. This was deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, eyes fixed on the window, and after a few minutes, it stopped. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound had been too heavy, too controlled. My mind raced. The cabin door was locked, but I realized that the lock was old and flimsy. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck, a deep sense of vulnerability settling over me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, wrapped in a blanket near the stove, gripping a heavy flashlight I had brought along. When the first hints of dawn appeared, casting pale gray light through the trees, I crept to the window. The forest was calm, still, normal, and I felt slightly foolish for my fear, but not entirely. Something had been outside. I could feel it in my bones. The day was tense. I avoided going outside alone, sticking to chores near the cabin. Gathering wood, filling the stove, and checking my supplies. I kept my phone close, sending a text to a friend in the city with my location, just in case. But each time I heard a branch snap or the crunch of leaves, my pulse jumped. By afternoon, the sun was bright, but the shadows were deep. Something about the forest felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were pressing in. Late that afternoon, I decided I needed to leave the cabin for a bit, to walk and clear my head. I grabbed a small pack, some water, and a pocket knife. I stayed close to the cabin at first, just the perimeter of the clearing, telling myself I wouldn't go far. The forest was dense. Each step felt muffled on the thick layer of pine needles. I heard rustling constantly, distant and faint, but close enough to make me tense. My mind went through every rational explanation. Squirrels, birds, wind, but none of them accounted for the feeling I had. That something was moving deliberately, silently, just beyond the trees, tracking me. I returned to the cabin an hour later, heart racing, convinced I had imagined it. The cabin seemed unchanged, benign in the daylight, and I tried to force myself to relax. I fortified the door with a heavy chair, stacked extra wood in front of the windows, and set the flashlight near my bed. I ate a meager dinner, lit the stove, and tried to read, but I couldn't focus. The forest outside seemed to darken unnaturally as the sun went down, and I kept glancing toward the trees, expecting to see movement that never came. That night was worse. The sounds outside started early, just after dusk. Scrapes along the siding of the cabin, heavy footsteps on the porch, thumps against the roof. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, every nerve on edge. I checked the door, reinforced it again, and held the flashlight across my lap. Hours passed in silence, broken by sudden noises that made me jump and catch my breath. At one point, a loud bang shook the cabin, making a window rattle. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself small, invisible. By morning, I realized I couldn't stay. I packed my things hastily, checking and rechecking the locks and windows. The sky was gray, the air still, and the forest seemed almost hostile, oppressive in its quiet. As I started the car, I heard one last noise behind me, a heavy scraping along the cabin wall. My hands shook on the keys, and I drove off as fast as I could, leaving the cabin behind, the dirt road kicking up dust behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, the pavement smooth and familiar under my wheels. I breathed deeply, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was over. I never went back to that cabin, and I never wanted to. The memory of those nights, of the scraping and the feeling of being watched, stayed with me, a persistent shadow in the back of my mind. Months later, I read about a man who had been living illegally in a remote cabin in those same woods. He had broken into several cabins, living off supplies from renters and local cabins, and no one had suspected him because the area was so isolated. He had a record of violent behavior, but the authorities caught him before anyone was seriously harmed. I realized with a chill that the noises I had heard, the sense of being stalked, were not imagination. They had been him, moving silently, deliberately, close enough that I felt his presence but never saw him. That realization, chilling as it was, also brought relief. I had survived, and the danger I had felt, though terrifying, had not resulted in harm. I understood the risk, and I learned to respect it. I also realized how fragile safety can be, how quickly isolation can turn from peaceful to perilous. I still think about that cabin sometimes, the forest, the oppressive silence. But I also know I made it out. I took steps to ensure I would be safer in the future, learning to research remote areas more carefully, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate the isolation of the wilderness. It took time, but I eventually stopped feeling that constant tension when I thought about those nights. I rebuilt my sense of calm slowly, piece by piece, understanding that while the fear had been real, my response and my choices had mattered most. I never returned to that part of the forest, but the experience left me with a deep respect for solitude, for the quiet dangers that exist in the world, and for the resilience we can discover within ourselves when faced with something truly frightening. The memory of those nights is still vivid, but it is tempered now with a sense of accomplishment, of having survived a situation far beyond what I thought I could endure. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. The idea had started as a simple need to get away from everything: the city, work, constant noise, people, deadlines. I found a small cabin for rent tucked deep in the mountains, far off any main road, surrounded by dense forest. The pictures online made it look perfect. Wooden exterior, a small porch, a fireplace, and tall windows that let in a lot of light. It promised privacy, quiet, and a chance to just exist somewhere else for a week. I packed my car carefully the night before, making sure I had everything I might need: food, water, clothes for the cold nights, a first aid kit, flashlights, extra batteries, a small camping stove, and a few books I had been meaning to read. I also brought a knife, not for protection necessarily, but because in isolated areas you never know when a tool like that could be useful. The drive took longer than I expected. The GPS worked until it didn't. At some point, the paved road ended, and a narrow dirt track started, winding up through the trees. The forest around me was thick and dark, even in the middle of the day, and the air smelled earthy and damp. The more I drove, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. After nearly 2 hours of driving up winding, unmarked trails, I finally saw it. The cabin, sitting alone in a small clearing. There was no one else around for miles, only forest and the sound of distant streams. The cabin itself was solid. The wood was aged but well maintained. I parked my car beside it and stepped out, noticing how still the air was. Even the leaves seemed frozen. I carried my bags inside, setting them down in the small living area. The place smelled faintly of dust and old wood. I walked around, inspecting it. There was a small kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom with a simple bed, and the fireplace that looked as if it hadn't been used in months. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I unpacked slowly, putting food in the small fridge, arranging clothes in the drawers, and checking the bathroom. I kept glancing out the windows at the forest beyond, noticing the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. The place felt peaceful, almost serene, until I realized I had been staring at one spot in the trees for far too long, my imagination starting to fill the spaces between the trunks with shapes that weren't there. Night came quickly. I lit the fireplace, listening to the crackle of the wood and the occasional pop from the flames. I ate a simple dinner, mostly canned beans and bread, and tried to read, but the forest outside seemed louder at night. Every rustle, every snap of a branch made me tense. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just animals, but my stomach tightened each time the sound came from deeper in the trees. I made sure the doors were locked, the windows shut, and double-checked the small security chain on the front door. The first night passed without incident, but sleep was shallow. Every small sound felt amplified in the cabin, and I woke several times, staring at the dark windows. When morning came, I stepped outside to see the forest in daylight. The sunlight made the trees look less threatening, and I felt a sense of relief. I spent the day walking along a small trail behind the cabin, noting the way the trees grew denser the further I went. I collected some dry wood for the fireplace, thinking ahead to the next night. It was the second night when things started to feel wrong. I had gone to bed early, the fire long out, the cabin dark except for the faint light from the moon through the windows. I was half asleep when I heard it. A scraping sound, soft at first, like someone dragging a heavy object across the dirt outside. I froze, listening. Came again, closer this time, moving along the edge of the clearing. My heart rate picked up. I stayed quiet, thinking it might be a deer or some other animal. The noise stopped after a few minutes, leaving the silence even more noticeable. I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, and moved to the window, shining the light into the darkness outside. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no shape, just shadows. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it, but the unease lingered. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every small sound, the wind, the branches, the occasional distant animal, felt like it was moving closer to the cabin. The next morning, I found something strange. There were footprints in the dirt just beyond the clearing, large, heavy, and definitely human. They weren't from any hiker. The shape was wrong, rough, uneven, and they ended at the edge of the trees. My stomach sank. I thought about leaving immediately, but I also realized my car was parked where it was, and the trail back was narrow and winding. I could be trapped if whoever or whatever made those prints was still nearby. I spent the day making small preparations, moving the heavier furniture against the door, checking the knife in my kitchen drawer, and keeping the flashlight close. That night was worse. I heard whispers, soft and almost indecipherable, coming from the forest. The scraping came again, and this time it circled the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed in the living room, listening, trying to see shapes through the dark windows, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the trees. At one point, I saw a figure, tall and moving slowly, just beyond the tree-line. My stomach froze and I held the light steady. It didn't run, didn't shout, didn't make any movement except to stay just at the edge of visibility. I realized with a sinking feeling that it had been watching me, waiting, patient. The third day was tense. I didn't go far from the cabin, only enough to check the firewood and make sure the surrounding area was clear. The forest seemed different somehow, the shadows longer, the air heavier. I kept the doors locked, even during the day, and checked all the windows multiple times. The footprints hadn't gone away. I noticed other signs too. Broken branches, flattened grass, subtle things that suggested someone, or something, was moving near the cabin even when I couldn't see it. That night was unbearable. The figure returned, moving closer this time, circling the cabin with deliberate care. I could see its outline through the window, slow and deliberate. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think clearly. I remembered the knife, the heavy furniture, and the fact that I could make noise to draw attention if needed. I stayed in the living room, watching, listening. The figure finally stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It stood there, perfectly still, as if considering whether to approach. Hours passed like this. Eventually, it retreated, slipping back into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun came up, I began making plans to leave. I packed as much as I could into my car, moving slowly, carefully scanning the tree-line for any sign of movement. My hands shook, and my heart was still racing. I decided to take the main trail back, even though it meant a longer drive because it was visible and open, and I wouldn't have to navigate blind in the forest. The journey back was tense. I drove cautiously, stopping whenever I saw movement in the trees, ready to accelerate or reverse if needed. I passed the clearing where the cabin had stood, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly. I didn't see anyone. The forest seemed calm now, almost peaceful, but the unease lingered. By the time I reached the paved road and then the first gas station, I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. I sat in the car for several minutes, collecting myself, before continuing on. Looking back, I realized I had narrowly avoided a disaster. Whatever had been watching the cabin was patient, organized, and dangerous. It wasn't a supernatural being, it wasn't a fairy tale creature, it was a human, probably someone used to moving in the forest, maybe with bad intentions. I reported the footprints and the cabin's situation to the local authorities once I returned to the city. They said the area had a history of occasional break-ins and that people renting isolated cabins sometimes attracted unwanted attention, but nothing had been reported recently. In the weeks after, I was careful about going back into isolated areas. I understood now how vulnerable you could be when alone in a place like that. I stayed aware, cautious, and learned to trust my instincts in a way I hadn't before. The cabin trip had given me peace in planning, but the experience itself reminded me how quickly solitude could turn dangerous. It was a lesson I would never forget. The forest might seem calm, the cabin might seem safe, but you are never truly alone, and sometimes the most terrifying things aren't ghosts. They are human, patient, and waiting. I eventually rented another cabin, but this time one closer to a small town, with people nearby and clear access to help if needed. I enjoyed the solitude more safely, always keeping a line of sight to the road and the surrounding area, always prepared. The memory of that first cabin, the scraping, the figure at the edge of the trees, stayed with me, but it also made me wiser, more alert, and more appreciative of security and foresight. By the end, I realized the good part wasn't the trip itself. It was surviving it and learning to It started as a plan I thought would be simple. I had found a small, rustic cabin online, tucked deep into the woods of northern Vermont. The pictures made it look inviting. A wooden structure with a pitched roof, smoke curling from a stone chimney, and a small porch with a creaking railing. It was isolated, surrounded by thick pine forest, with only a narrow dirt road leading to it. I wanted a break from everything: work, social obligations, the constant hum of city life. I wanted solitude, the kind where no one could reach me for days. At first, it felt like freedom. The drive there was longer than I expected. GPS signals faded in and out as I climbed the hills, the road narrowing into uneven gravel patches lined with overgrown shrubs. There were moments when I thought I might have missed the turn entirely, or worse, ended up on a logging path, but eventually, the trees thinned, and I saw the cabin tucked in a small clearing. It was exactly as it looked in the photos, more real than I imagined. The air was cold, crisp, and carried the sharp scent of pine. I parked my car, loaded my backpack with essentials, and walked toward the cabin, feeling the crunch of frost-covered leaves under my boots. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of old wood and damp earth. Dust clung to surfaces, and a thin layer of cobwebs covered corners and ceiling beams. It was obvious no one had been here for weeks, maybe months. There were supplies left behind: a stack of firewood in the corner, a kettle on the stove, a few cans of beans and rice in a wooden cabinet. The windows, though dusty, let in slivers of pale sunlight. I decided to settle in slowly, unpacking my things and exploring each room. The cabin had a main living area with a small kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a loft bedroom accessible by a narrow ladder. Everything was functional but basic. I liked that. The first night was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. I had brought a lantern, a flashlight, and matches, though the cabin had a wood stove that I intended to use. Lighting the fire was harder than I expected. The kindling was damp, and the logs smelled musty. After several failed attempts, I finally got a small flame going. The warmth spread slowly, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Sitting in the dim glow, I felt a mix of accomplishment and isolation. There was no one to talk to, no background noise, nothing but the small pop of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The next morning, I explored the surrounding area. The cabin was in a small clearing, but the forest stretched far beyond, dense and unbroken. I found a small stream not far from the cabin, where the water was icy but clear, and the ground near the bank was soft with moss. I decided to gather some firewood for the next few days. Walking through the trees, I realized how deep into the wilderness I truly was. The sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy in places, and shadows shifted constantly. I kept telling myself I was fine, that this was exactly the kind of solitude I wanted, but there was a constant, subtle tension in the air, a feeling of being watched, though I knew logically that no one was there. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin and prepared a small meal. Heating the canned beans over the stove, I tried to focus on the simplicity of the task. But even mundane things felt strangely intense. The sound of the stove clicking and hissing, the aroma of food, even the feel of the wooden floor beneath my bare feet. Everything was amplified. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone or something moving in the trees. Of course, there was nothing, but my mind refused to relax entirely. I told myself it was just the isolation, that my brain was looking for patterns, for signs of life where there were none. The real sense of unease began on the second night. Around midnight, I woke to a sharp noise outside, like someone stomping on dry branches. I froze, my ears straining to hear more. The wind had picked up, but this sound was different, too deliberate to be random. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the door. The darkness outside felt like a physical wall pressing against me. The beam of the flashlight cut through the trees but revealed nothing. I searched the perimeter, moving slowly and deliberately, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots. Nothing. No footprints, no movement. Just the echo of my own breathing and the occasional creak of the cabin. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the thought of someone approaching the cabin, unknown and silent, lingered in the back of my mind. The following day, I decided to make my stay more secure. I reinforced the door with a spare plank I found in the shed and stacked some logs in front of the windows. It felt excessive, but it helped my nerves. I also marked a few trails in the surrounding forest so I could track my movements and ensure I could always find my way back. As I did this, I noticed how isolated I truly was. There were no distant sounds of cars, no dogs barking, no voices. Even the birds seemed scarce. The forest felt different, more watchful, almost alive in its silence. That night, the noise returned, louder this time. It started with twigs snapping, then a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a soft scraping sound near the cabin walls. My heart raced as I held the flashlight tightly, scanning the area. The beam fell on nothing but shadows, yet I could hear subtle movements, deliberate, cautious, almost patient. I realized then that whoever or whatever was outside knew exactly where I was. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I stayed up most of the night, listening to every sound, my flashlight in hand, my ears straining against the dark. The wind died down eventually, and the forest became silent again, but the tension remained. The next morning, I considered leaving. The idea of packing up and retreating to civilization was tempting, but I reminded myself of why I had come. I needed to face this, to understand my limits, to survive on my own. I spent the day gathering more firewood and inspecting the cabin. That's when I noticed faint footprints in the snow near the back of the cabin. They were small, cautious, and led into the forest but did not return. My stomach churned. Someone had been here. Someone had watched me sleep. I checked my supplies, ensured the doors were secure, and decided to stay vigilant. There was no evidence of entry into the cabin, so perhaps the intruder hadn't come inside. But the thought that they could, at any time, was chilling. I spent the following days in a heightened state of awareness. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, every distant howl of an animal made my pulse quicken. I barely slept, eating cold meals by the stove and constantly checking the windows. The isolation had become oppressive, and the forest seemed to close in around the cabin. One afternoon, I ventured further than before, trying to map the area in my mind. I found a small, abandoned hunting blind on a rise, overlooking a clearing. It gave me a vantage point, but it also made me aware of just how exposed I was. The forest was dense, unpredictable, and full of hiding places. I realized I wasn't dealing with just boredom or solitude anymore. I was dealing with potential danger, and I had no immediate way to call for help. On the fifth night, the intruder came close. I was lying in the loft, trying to sleep, when I heard deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, slow, methodical, as if someone was testing my defenses. I held my breath, clutching a heavy log from the firewood pile, listening as they stopped near the front door, scraping lightly against the wood. Then a sound like a small stone being thrown against the window. I shined my flashlight, but the beam only caught shadows. The tension was unbearable. I didn't dare leave the loft, didn't dare make any sound. Hours passed, the movements outside eventually fading into the distance. By dawn, there was no sign of the intruder, only the faint depression of footprints in the frost. At this point, I knew I couldn't continue the way I was. I had to get out, but the isolation of the area meant any attempt to leave could be risky. I began preparing for a cautious departure. I packed essential supplies, water, food, my backpack, some warm clothing, and planned a route back to the main road. I waited until early morning when visibility was better. Stepping out of the cabin, I moved quickly but quietly, avoiding obvious paths. I kept the cabin in sight as I made my way through the underbrush, the footprints from the intruder still fresh and unsettling. The forest felt like a maze, each tree and shadow a potential threat. Hours later, exhausted and anxious, I reached the gravel road that led back to civilization. The sense of relief was overwhelming. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. But there was only the empty forest, indifferent and silent. The cabin, which had seemed so inviting days ago, now felt like a trap, a place that had tested my nerves and my will to. I had always wanted to escape the city for a while, to disconnect completely from the constant noise and pressure of work, traffic, and the relentless glow of screens. The idea of a cabin far from everything, somewhere deep in the woods, had been growing in my mind for months. When I finally found a small, rustic cabin listed for rent online, isolated but accessible, I jumped at the chance. The photos showed a simple wooden structure with a porch, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. It wasn't luxurious, but it promised solitude, and that's what I needed. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected. The paved road ended abruptly, and I found myself winding through a dirt path, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to lean in close on either side. The sun was already low when I arrived, casting long shadows that moved with the uneven ground. I parked my car near the cabin and got out, taking in the smell of damp earth and pine. The silence was overwhelming, almost heavy. No cars, no birds, no signs of human life. Just the faint rustling of the wind through the branches. The cabin itself was small but solid. The wooden walls had weathered over the years, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it had character. Inside, the floors creaked in familiar ways, the kind of creaks that made you aware of every step. Dust lay in thin layers on the windowsills, and the furniture, though sparse, looked sturdy. I unpacked my things quickly, eager to settle in before it became dark. I lit the fireplace, relishing the crackle of the flames and the warmth they brought. Outside, the forest darkened rapidly, and I realized I couldn't even see the edge of the trees. Night fell faster than I expected. Once the sun disappeared, the forest turned into a mass of shadows, and the noises became sharper, closer, more distinct. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and somewhere far off, the howl of a coyote. At first, it felt natural, the way nature always does at night. But then the sounds became more irregular, more deliberate. Something was moving in the darkness just outside the window, though I couldn't see it. I reminded myself that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the unease lingered. I tried to distract myself with chores inside the cabin. I swept the floors, stacked firewood, and organized my supplies. Everything was simple and mundane, but each small noise from outside made me jump. At some point, I realized the forest was unnervingly quiet again. The usual background sounds had stopped, replaced by a stillness that made me tense. Then I heard it, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the side of the cabin. My heart jumped. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously went to the window. Nothing. The beam of light swept the trees, the underbrush, the shadows, but there was no movement, no sign of life. I told myself it was probably a branch scraping against the cabin, but even as I said it, the sound continued, irregular now, closer. I decided to secure the cabin more thoroughly. I checked the locks on the doors and windows and made sure nothing could get inside. But the scratching didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more urgent, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I felt trapped, a sudden awareness of how isolated I really was. My phone had poor signal, and I doubted I could get help if something actually happened. I wanted to believe it was an animal, but something about the pattern of the sound made it feel almost intentional, as if whatever was out there was testing the cabin, waiting, circling. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay on the bed, listening intently, waiting for the slightest noise. Every branch snap outside sent a jolt through me. The wind picked up and the trees scratched against the roof, but I also heard heavier, slower movements, something that could not have been a simple animal. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, and when I finally ventured outside, I found deep paw-like prints in the mud circling the cabin. They were larger than any dog, more elongated, more deliberate. I realized then that it had been more than a raccoon or coyote. Over the next days, I tried to remain calm. I reinforced the windows, stayed close to the cabin during daylight, and kept the fire going at night. I explored the surrounding area cautiously, marking the distance I could go safely. Each day, I noticed signs that something was moving around me. Footprints, broken branches, disturbed underbrush. And every night, the sounds returned. The heavy steps, the scratching, the occasional low growl. I started sleeping in shifts with a makeshift barricade by the bedroom door, keeping a heavy branch nearby, and I stocked water and food inside so I could minimize going outside after dark. The experience became a routine of vigilance. I never left the cabin alone at night, and even during the day, I moved slowly and cautiously. Over time, I noticed patterns. The animal, whatever it was, stayed on the edge of the clearing. It would watch me, but it never tried to get inside as long as I was alert and cautious. By the end of the week, I realized I was exhausted, mentally and physically. The isolation, combined with constant fear, had drained me completely. I knew I needed to leave, and I prepared to drive back down the long dirt path to civilization. I chose a clear, sunny day, when the forest was most visible and the tracks of any animals could be seen. I packed everything carefully, double-checked the cabin, and started walking toward the car. I stayed vigilant, moving quickly but quietly. The forest seemed calmer in daylight, but I kept my eyes open for movement in the trees. When I finally reached the car, I felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. I started the engine, the sound startling in the quiet forest, and carefully drove down the dirt path. I didn't stop for anything, not even for the beauty of the trees or the sunlight filtering through the leaves. I kept moving until I reached the paved road, where I finally allowed myself to breathe fully again. Even now, months later, I remember that week vividly. The fear, the isolation, the constant vigilance. It stayed with me, but so did the lesson. Nature is beautiful, but it is also wild, unpredictable, and dangerous. Respecting it means understanding its boundaries and your own limitations. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't plan to, but I survived, and I learned that preparation, awareness, and respect for the environment are the only real protections when you are completely alone in the wild. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the endless traffic, the noise, and the constant pressure of work, filled me with a rare sense of excitement. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far enough away from any main road that I would be forced to slow down, to exist in a completely different rhythm. It was late autumn, the trees mostly bare, their skeletal branches clawing at the pale gray sky. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, and I had driven through winding forest roads for hours before finally arriving at the cabin. The cabin itself was small but solid. Weathered logs formed its walls, darkened by years of rain and sun, giving it a rustic charm. A narrow porch ran along the front, its boards slightly warped but still sturdy. The door had a simple metal latch and a small, grimy window that offered a view into the main room. I parked my car on a patch of dirt that had been flattened by previous visitors, grabbed my bag, and approached the cabin, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and unease. There was a silence here that felt absolute, not just the absence of sound, but the absence of life. No birds, no rustling animals, nothing but the occasional gust of wind pushing dead leaves across the ground. I stepped inside, letting the door creak closed behind me. The smell of old wood and dust greeted me immediately. The main room was simple. A worn couch, a small table, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in months. I placed my bag on the floor and walked over to the window. Beyond it, the forest stretched endlessly, bare trees fading into the misty distance. There was a trail leading into the woods, barely visible, and I realized this would be my only way to explore the area safely. I spent the next hour unpacking and organizing my things. I had brought a small camping stove, enough food for 2 days, some bottled water, and a few basic tools. I found a stack of firewood in the corner and inspected it, making a mental note that I would need to light a fire before nightfall. I also discovered a small, handwritten logbook tucked under a loose floorboard. It was filled with entries from previous visitors, mostly brief notes about their stay, the weather, and occasional observations about the forest. Some of the notes mentioned feeling watched or hearing strange noises, but I dismissed these as typical overreactions from people isolated in the woods. By the time I had finished organizing, the sun was low in the sky. Shadows stretched long across the cabin floor, and the temperature began to drop noticeably. I gathered some kindling and started a small fire in the fireplace, the smoke curling lazily upward and filling the room with warmth. Sitting in front of the fire, I felt a comforting sense of solitude, the kind of solitude that, while tense at first, gradually eases your mind into a rhythm of observation and reflection. I watched the flames dance, listening to the soft crackling, and felt the tension from the drive begin to fade. Night came quickly. Once darkness fell outside, the forest transformed. Shapes and silhouettes shifted constantly, and every gust of wind or snapping twig became magnified in the quiet. I double-checked the doors and windows, ensuring they were secure. Part of me wanted to explore the trail at night, but another part, deeper, more cautious, warned me against it. There was a raw, primal awareness that the woods were not entirely predictable. I knew the area could harbor animals, perhaps a wild bear or a roaming pack of coyotes, though the logbook suggested no serious incidents had occurred recently. Still, my imagination ran ahead, conjuring scenarios that felt both absurd and unsettling. Around midnight, I was lying on the couch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, when I first noticed the sound. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. A soft, rhythmic scratching coming from the side of the cabin, near the back. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, irregular now, a scratching that suggested something trying to force its way inside. My mind raced. I considered that it might be an animal, a raccoon, or a stray dog, perhaps even a larger predator testing the structure of the cabin. I reached for my flashlight and carefully moved toward the door at the back, my senses heightened to an almost painful degree. The beam of the flashlight illuminated nothing at first, just the dark outlines of trees and underbrush. Then I noticed movement, a shadow darting behind a tree, too quick to identify, too deliberate to dismiss as my imagination. The scratching came again, louder, more insistent, and this time accompanied by a faint thumping, as if something heavy was pressing against the wall. I felt a sudden surge of fear, cold and visceral, that made my hands shake. I knew I had to respond, and yet I hesitated. The cabin felt fragile, like a flimsy barrier between me and whatever lurked outside. I decided to barricade the door with the heaviest furniture I could move. I shoved the small table against the door and wedged the couch in place as well, trying to make it as difficult as possible for anything outside to push through. The noises continued intermittently, a mix of scratching and occasional thumps. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. I stayed awake, holding a small hatchet I had brought with me, scanning every shadow, every rustle in the dark. The fire dwindled, and I had to feed it small pieces of wood to keep the light and warmth. Each snap of a log, each crack, made me flinch. At some point, I realized that the scratching had stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise because it suggested waiting, patience, something observing me, considering its next move. I didn't sleep, not really, and when the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, I felt both exhausted and relieved. I cautiously approached the back door and peered outside. There was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed earth, no signs of anything unusual. Just the normal debris of the forest floor, leaves scattered by the wind. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the surroundings, and began to follow the faint trail leading deeper into the woods, hoping to understand what had caused the previous night's terror. The trail led me through dense undergrowth and past clusters of trees with thick trunks, their bark rough and mottled. As I walked, I noticed broken branches, patches of disturbed dirt, and what looked like claw marks on several trees. My heart sank. Whatever had been near the cabin had left evidence, and it wasn't small. I followed the trail cautiously, moving slowly and deliberately. The further I went, the more I realized that the forest was not simply a backdrop for solitude. It was alive with things that could, if provoked, be dangerous. Hours passed as I traced the evidence deeper into the forest. Eventually, I came upon a clearing. There, I saw the reason for the noises. A large black bear had been rummaging through a fallen tree, possibly looking for insects or small animals. Its massive paws had torn the earth apart, and I could see where it had tested the cabin the night before. Relief washed over me, tempered by lingering fear. I was lucky. A few minutes of poor timing or misplaced steps could have been catastrophic. I kept my distance, observing until the bear moved away into thicker brush, then cautiously returned to the cabin. Back inside, I reinforced the doors and windows, aware that the encounter had left me shaken but alive. I spent the next day gathering more firewood, organizing supplies, and preparing for a second night, this time with a greater sense of caution. I also took careful notes, mapping the surrounding area, marking potential hazards, and learning the rhythms of the forest around me. The sounds of the woods, once terrifying, became informative. I could tell the difference between the movement of small animals, the wind through branches, and the heavy, deliberate steps of something larger. Knowledge brought a measure of control, and with it, a slow easing of fear. By the end of the weekend, I had grown deeply aware of the balance between isolation and safety, between caution and panic. I left the cabin feeling changed, not triumphant but wiser, acutely aware of the fragility of human comfort in the face of the natural world. The experience had been terrifying in its immediacy, but it had also been a profound lesson in observation, preparedness, and respect. I returned home with a detailed journal, maps of the area, and a heightened understanding of how easily solitude could slip into danger, and how careful attention could turn fear into survival. I remember the first time I drove up the winding mountain road to the cabin. The trees were tall and thick, almost forming a tunnel of green that hid the sky in places. The sun was low, and the shadows stretched across the uneven dirt road, making the ride feel slower than it actually was. The car bounced over small rocks and dips, and I gripped the wheel tighter each time it lurched. I wasn't nervous in the usual way, not about bears or getting lost. It was the sense that I was leaving everything I knew behind. The world outside that tunnel of trees was a distant thought, like another life entirely. The cabin wasn't on a map I could trust. I had found it through a small rental website with a few pictures and an owner's brief note. The pictures showed a wooden structure surrounded by pines, a little porch with chairs, and a fire pit just off the porch. Nothing else, nothing that gave away how remote it actually was. The road ended at a clearing where the cabin sat. It was smaller than I expected, made of dark logs, with a tin roof that reflected the last rays of the sun. I parked the car and stepped out, the air immediately thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, not the kind of quiet that blankets a city at night, but a deeper quiet, where even the wind seemed subdued. My boots sank slightly in the soft soil as I walked to the cabin. The porch boards creaked under my weight, a single warning that this place was older than it looked in the pictures. Inside, it was dusty but tidy. There was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with 4 chairs, and a corner filled with shelves holding mismatched dishes and jars of dry goods. The living space had a couch that sagged in the middle and a small wood-burning stove, its chimney running straight up through the roof. The main bedroom was just off the living area, with a bed covered in a faded quilt. The windows were thick with grime, but I could see enough to understand that I was surrounded by nothing but forest. There were no neighbors, no other cabins visible, not even a road that led out, just trees. I had brought enough food and supplies to last a week. I unpacked slowly, taking in every detail of the place. The walls were sturdy, the floorboards solid, but the isolation was immediate. There was no internet, no cell signal, not even a hint of radio. I realized then that if something went wrong, I would have to handle it myself. The thought sent a small shiver down my spine, but I dismissed it. I had planned this trip to be alone, to clear my head and disconnect from everything. The isolation was supposed to be part of the experience, part of the peace I thought I needed. The first night passed quietly. I built a fire in the stove, ate a simple meal, and went to bed early. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and an owl called somewhere in the distance. I lay in bed, listening, feeling both the comfort of being alone and the subtle edge of fear that came from knowing I was utterly alone. The next morning, I woke to heavy rain. It was steady, drumming on the tin roof and pooling on the uneven ground outside. I stayed inside, moving slowly, watching the water run down the windows. The rain made the cabin feel smaller, enclosed, but it was also soothing in a strange way. I spent the day cleaning, organizing, reading, and staring at the rain-slicked forest outside. But as the evening approached, I noticed something unsettling. The silence of the forest was absolute. The rain was loud, yes, but underneath it, there were no sounds of birds, no squirrels rustling, nothing. It was like the forest had gone mute. I chalked it up to the weather, a temporary stillness, but it lingered in the back of my mind. On the third day, the rain stopped, leaving the forest damp and heavy with the smell of wet earth. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I walked along a narrow path that led into the forest, each step crunching over wet leaves and twigs. The trees were dense, branches intertwined so that the sunlight barely reached the ground. After walking for what felt like an hour, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The path faded, turning into uneven terrain. I considered turning back, but I wanted to see how far it went. That's when I heard it, a snapping of a branch behind me. It was soft, almost masked by the sound of the wind through the trees, but my ears picked it up. I stopped, listening. Nothing. I started walking again, slower this time, trying to convince myself it was a deer or some small animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A sharp crack, like someone had stepped on a branch just a few feet away. My heart rate accelerated. I picked up my pace, careful not to make too much noise, hoping whoever or whatever it was would leave. I reached the edge of a small clearing and stopped. The trees opened up into a space where sunlight dappled the ground. I scanned the area carefully. Nothing. No movement. No shape. Just the forest and its quiet presence. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm myself. I decided it was enough for today and turned back toward the cabin. But as I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud. Large footprints, not human exactly, but too big and uneven to be an animal. They led away from the clearing, back toward the cabin. My stomach dropped, quickened my pace. I reached the cabin and locked the door behind me. I checked the windows. Everything looked normal. I tried to rationalize the footprints. Maybe someone had been hiking before me and left the path, maybe a large animal, maybe just a trick of the mud, but deep down I knew this was different. There was an awareness in the forest now, a presence that felt deliberate. Over the next few days, I became increasingly alert. Every noise, every shadow, every rustle in the trees made me jump. I kept a fire going constantly, leaving lights on in the windows to create the illusion of occupancy. I reinforced the door with a thick branch, checking all the locks repeatedly. I rationed my food carefully, knowing that if I needed to leave quickly, I had to be able to do so without panic. On the fifth day, I woke to find the footprints again, fresh this time, circling the cabin. They were too large for any animal I knew, and they followed no clear path, moving around the cabin in a pattern that suggested someone or something had been observing me. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I was alone, and the forest was closing in around me. I spent the day barricading the windows, piling furniture near the doors, and preparing for the worst. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every brush against the roof, every gust of wind felt like a threat. I kept the fire going, watching the shadows dance across the walls. Hours passed slowly, each one stretching into an eternity. I thought about leaving, about running into the forest to find help. But the forest was endless and I didn't know the way. I realized then that the only way to survive was to remain calm and wait for daylight, when I could see clearly and plan my escape. The next morning, I noticed tracks leading away from the cabin into the thicker forest. They were fresh, showing that whatever had been circling me had moved on. I waited until mid-morning, then cautiously stepped outside. The forest was alive again, birds chirping, squirrels moving through the trees. The silence that had haunted me for days was gone. I took a deep breath, feeling relief wash over me, but I didn't relax completely. I packed quickly, making sure nothing was left behind that could slow me down. I drove back down the mountain road slowly, constantly scanning the trees for movement. The forest seemed different now, aware of me in a way it hadn't before. Every shadow felt like a pair of eyes watching, every sound like a warning. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was high, and the cabin was far behind me. I stopped at a small gas station, trembling as I refueled and called someone to let them know I was safe. When I look back on that week, I realize how close I came to losing myself in fear. The cabin was not haunted. No spirits lurked in the woods. No supernatural forces threatened me. The danger was real, grounded in the isolation, in the unknowns of the forest, and in my own mind. I learned that fear can be as dangerous as any physical threat, that being unprepared can turn even a small situation into a life-threatening one, and that awareness, patience, and careful planning can save you in ways you never expect. The experience changed me. I stopped underestimating isolation, respect for nature, and the power of vigilance. I returned to the cabin once, months later, with friends, and it felt different, safe, almost ordinary, stripped of the tension that had consumed me the first time. But I will never forget the week I spent alone there, the way the forest seemed to watch, the way the quiet could make your own thoughts feel like a threat, and the overwhelming relief of finally stepping back into the world I knew. I had been driving for hours, the kind of hours where the scenery outside your window starts to blur into a grayish haze of trees, rocks, and patches of uneven sunlight. The GPS signal had become unreliable a long time ago, cutting in and out like it didn't quite want me to reach the small town where the dirt road to the cabin began. The road itself was barely more than a trail, worn into the earth from decades of sporadic use, and it wound through thick pines that loomed overhead like silent, watchful sentinels. I remember the moment I realized how isolated I really was. There were no signs, no markers, no other vehicles. Even the birds were quiet, and a strange, lingering stillness had settled around me that made my skin crawl. I had rented this cabin online from a small, almost obscure listing. It promised solitude, a chance to get away from the city, to breathe air that wasn't thick with exhaust fumes or the constant hum of human activity. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, sturdy and rustic, sitting by a small clearing with a creek running nearby. In the listing, everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The host's description emphasized privacy and quiet surroundings, which sounded ideal at the time. I had been eager to leave my busy life behind, to escape the constant pressure of work, the relentless noise, and the never-ending notifications on my phone. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin was supposed to be, the sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and pink. I parked the car at the edge of the dirt trail and climbed out, feeling the sudden weight of silence press down on me. There was no one around, and the wind carried a strange, almost metallic tang that I couldn't place. The cabin stood just ahead, as the pictures had shown. A simple rectangular structure, its wooden siding weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The windows reflected the dying light, giving the place a hollow, almost lifeless appearance. I carried my backpack across the uneven ground, the dirt and pine needles crunching beneath my boots. When I reached the porch, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, swinging gently on its hinges. My stomach twisted with unease. I had confirmed with the host that I would have a key, and yet here the door moved as if inviting or warning me. I paused, listening. The wind shifted through the trees, a low whistling sound, and for a moment I thought I heard a faint, metallic scraping from inside the cabin. I shook it off, telling myself it was probably the old wood settling, maybe a branch hitting the siding. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly acrid, like a combination of mold and old smoke. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved further in, scanning the interior. There was a small living area with a worn sofa and a wooden table, a kitchenette in the corner with a rust-streaked sink, and a single bedroom at the back. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, and the windows were streaked with grime. I unpacked my bag, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew logically there was no one here. As the sun sank completely behind the horizon, the forest outside became a deep, impenetrable black. The only light came from the cabin's old, flickering lamp, which cast long, wavering shadows against the walls. I made myself a cup of coffee, the sound of the kettle hissing and the liquid pouring into the cup echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. I sat at the table, staring out the window at the dense trees, and tried to calm myself. This was just a cabin in the woods. There was nothing here but isolation and quiet. Nothing more. The unease grew as night fell. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every creak of the floor, every shift in the wind outside made me flinch. The sound of something heavy scraping against wood reached my ears intermittently, and each time I paused, heart hammering, straining to hear the next movement. The cabin had an odd layout, with walls that didn't quite line up symmetrically, so sound carried in unpredictable ways. A small bump in the ceiling above me made me freeze. I knew it could be anything, a branch against the roof, a small animal, but the instinctual fear of the unknown tightened around my chest. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and stepped outside, the cold night air immediately biting at my skin. The forest around me was dense, trees standing shoulder to shoulder, their leaves rustling softly in a wind that had picked up. I moved slowly, shining the beam of the flashlight over the ground, the trunks, the shadows. Nothing. The clearing was empty. The only sound was the wind and the faint babbling of the creek. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something that had escaped me in the daylight. Footprints. Faint, muddy tracks leading from the edge of the clearing to the cabin's porch. My stomach dropped. They were too large to be from a dog, and they didn't resemble any human shoe prints I had seen. They were uneven, with long strides, and they ended right at the porch, where I had seen the door ajar. I shone the flashlight at the door, and the faint outline of scratches along the wood became visible. My pulse quickened. Someone or something had been here. I spent the next few hours sitting in the cabin, every sense alert. I checked the windows repeatedly, ensuring they were locked, even though some had no functioning locks at all. I could hear the forest outside shifting, the occasional snapping of branches, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but the sound had a deliberate rhythm, a weight to it, like it was testing me, circling, waiting. Morning brought a false sense of relief. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the cabin in a warm glow. I ventured outside again, hoping to convince myself that nothing had happened, that the footprints were just an animal's or that my imagination had gotten the better of me. But when I reached the edge of the clearing, I found fresh tire tracks in the dirt, tracks that hadn't been there the night before. They led further down the trail into the dense forest, and I realized with a cold jolt that someone had come close enough to the cabin to park without my noticing. Fear turned into determination. I wasn't going to be trapped here or fall prey to some unknown threat. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the doors with wooden planks from the inside, moved furniture in front of windows that couldn't be secured, and stacked heavy objects near entry points. I even found an old axe in the corner of the cabin and kept it near me at all times. I made sure to have my phone charged, though the signal remained weak and unreliable, just 1 or 2 bars blinking intermittently. The night came again, and with it, the oppressive silence of the woods. I kept the lamp on, moved the sofa to cover a window, and sat in a corner, eyes fixed on the door. I couldn't sleep, couldn't close my eyes for fear of not noticing someone or something entering. Hours passed like this, and I could hear soft steps outside, circling, shifting from one side of the cabin to another. Occasionally, a low scrape would echo against the walls, making me flinch. I knew that if anyone tried to come in, I had only seconds to react. By the third night, I had begun noticing patterns. The presence outside wasn't random. It followed the rhythm of my own movements. When I moved from one side of the cabin to the other, the sounds would shift correspondingly. It was as if whoever or whatever it was watching, learning, waiting for the right moment. I realized I couldn't stay inside forever, that I needed to escape before this escalated. The idea of leaving during daylight seemed too risky. The person or animal could be hiding, waiting for me. I planned my exit meticulously. I chose a route that went through the creek and along a less visible path into the forest, hoping the cover of underbrush would keep me hidden. I packed everything I could carry, leaving nothing behind that might slow me down. I moved silently, listening for any signs of pursuit. The forest was thick, each step careful, deliberate. I could hear the distant rumble of a vehicle far down the trail, but it was impossible to tell if it was related or just a passerby. My heart raced with every sound, but I pressed on, knowing that hesitation could cost me. After hours of navigating the dense forest, clambering over fallen logs and wading through cold, murky water, I finally reached a logging road I recognized from the map. From there, I was able to catch a weak cell signal, enough to call local authorities and explain my situation. They sent someone to meet me, guiding me to safety while I remained on the phone, breathless and soaked, every muscle trembling. Eventually, I reached the nearest town, where I was able to rest and finally breathe without the constant fear pressing down on me. In the aftermath, authorities inspected the cabin. They found signs of repeated trespassing, deep footprints in the mud, and scratch marks on the door. The cabin had been targeted before, apparently by someone living off the grid who used the isolation to their advantage. It was a relief to know it wasn't a hallucination, that the fear I experienced was grounded in reality. The experience left a permanent mark on me. I learned to respect isolation. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. I needed a break from the city, from the constant noise and endless movement, and I wanted a place where I could be completely alone, at least for a little while. I rented a small cabin deep in the mountains, far off the main roads, reachable only by a narrow dirt trail that wound its way through dense forest. The pictures online showed a rustic log cabin with a small porch overlooking a clearing, surrounded by tall pines and the hint of a stream somewhere nearby. The idea of isolation both excited and unnerved me, but I felt ready. I packed my car with the essentials: canned food, a small camping stove, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, water, and my backpack loaded with hiking gear. I didn't bring a phone charger, thinking the lack of service would be part of the experience. The drive there was long and rough, the roads getting narrower and bumpier the further I went into the mountains. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already low in the sky, spilling golden light through the branches. I parked the car and took a deep breath, feeling the cool mountain air fill my lungs. The silence was immediate. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, like the forest itself is listening. I hoisted my backpack and started walking, the trail winding unevenly through roots and rocks, the trees closing in around me. I reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The first thing I noticed was how dark the forest became so quickly. Shadows stretched across the trail, and the cabin looked smaller than it had online, tucked tightly against the trees. It was charming, though, the wood dark and weathered, the roof slightly sagging, the windows reflecting the dim light. I set my pack down, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, a mixture of comfort and abandonment. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A small kitchen area, a living space with a wood stove, a bed tucked into a corner, and a loft above that could be used for storage or sleeping. There were a few dishes in the cupboard, a stack of firewood, and an old lantern hanging on a hook. Everything was quiet, untouched except by whoever had cleaned it last. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting up my sleeping area, and preparing a simple dinner. I lit a fire in the stove, watching the flames dance and throw shadows across the walls. As the night came, the silence outside grew heavier. I stepped out onto the porch to stretch, and the forest seemed to go on forever. The only sounds were distant rustling in the undergrowth, the occasional bird calling, and the wind whispering through the pine needles. The sense of isolation was intoxicating, but also slightly unnerving. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way quiet can play tricks on your mind. Night fell completely, and I went to bed early, exhausted from the hike. I slept fitfully, waking occasionally to strange creaks and groans from the cabin, the kind of noises that happen when wood settles and temperature changes. Around 3 a.m., I woke again, not sure why. The cabin was silent except for the wind outside. That's when I noticed it. A faint sound, almost like footsteps, coming from the front of the cabin. My heart started racing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and steady, not like anything I had heard from wildlife before. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The steps stopped. Then a soft scraping sound followed, like someone dragging a foot across the porch boards. My mind raced. I hadn't locked the door properly. Could someone have followed me here? My first instinct was to reach for the flashlight on the nightstand, but my hands were shaking. I slowly got out of bed and crept toward the door, every nerve on edge. The porch was empty, nothing but shadows and the faint glint of moonlight on the forest floor. I checked the door, it was locked, properly this time. My stomach sank. I sat back down on the bed, trying to calm myself, listening to the forest. The next day, I decided I would explore the surrounding area, hoping the motion would clear my mind. I hiked along the trail behind the cabin, noting the density of the forest, the way the trees blocked the sun, how the shadows moved and stretched over roots and rocks. I came across a small stream, clear and cold, and filled my water bottle. I noticed footprints in the mud along the edge, small, like someone had been walking there recently. My heart skipped. They didn't look like deer prints. I checked the surrounding area carefully but saw no one. It was unsettling, but I tried to rationalize. Maybe a hiker had passed the way earlier. The thought didn't calm me as much as I wanted it to. That night, I decided to stay vigilant. I kept the fire burning, a pot of water on the stove, my flashlight within reach. Around midnight, the noises started again. The soft scraping outside, faint knocks on the door, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving near the cabin. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, clutching my knife, listening. Hours passed. I realized that whoever it was didn't want to make direct contact. It was as if they were testing me, watching from the shadows, patient and deliberate. The air grew colder. I noticed condensation forming on the windows, and I saw shapes moving outside, fleeting shadows among the trees. My body trembled, but I stayed quiet, trying to remain calm. By the third day, I had decided to leave the cabin. The fear had settled deep into my bones. I packed quickly, eating only a few bites, and loaded my backpack. I decided to take a different route back, one that would lead me to the main road faster. As I stepped onto the trail, I felt eyes on me. I walked briskly, scanning the forest, listening for any sound behind me. The trail was rough, the rocks and roots forcing me to watch every step, but I kept moving. After an hour, I thought I was safe, but then I heard footsteps again, not on the trail behind me, but moving parallel, in the forest, matching my pace. Panic surged. I broke into a run, stumbling over rocks, branches scraping my arms and legs. The sound followed, relentless, keeping pace with me. I ran until I reached a clearing, where the forest opened to a dirt road. My car was just visible at the edge of the clearing. Relief hit me in waves, but I didn't slow down. I reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and finally got the engine running. Tires spinning on the gravel, I raced down the road, glancing in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, shadows shifting unnaturally. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Once on the highway, the tension started to leave my body, but my nerves were raw. I drove straight to a gas station, pulled in, and tried to gather myself. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold the coffee I bought for warmth. I called the local ranger station, explained my situation, and they assured me the area had occasional trespassers, usually hunters or hikers, but that nothing was reported near the cabin. They advised me to stay away until daylight and to report anything unusual. That experience stayed with me. I couldn't explain who or what was watching me in those woods, but I learned the importance of vigilance, preparation, and trusting your instincts. I eventually returned home, but I never went back to that cabin. The forest that had seemed peaceful and inviting in the daylight became a place of unease and threat in the dark. I kept telling myself it was human trespassers, but even now, years later, I still feel the weight of those unseen eyes, the deliberate footsteps in the night, and the absolute silence that made every small sound feel like danger. It took months before I could go hiking again, and even then, I stayed on well-traveled trails. I made sure someone always knew my exact route, and I never went alone into the deep, isolated forests like that again. I also invested in proper safety gear, including bear spray, a stronger flashlight, and a small GPS device that could send an emergency signal. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to get out without confrontation. The experience changed how I view isolation, the wilderness, and the unpredictability of human or animal behavior in places far from help. That cabin trip, which I thought would be peaceful and restorative, turned into a stark lesson in fear, vigilance, and survival instincts. And even now, whenever I hear a branch snap behind me in a quiet forest, my heart still races, and I am reminded of that night, the cabin, and the unknown that lurked just beyond the shadows. I never expected a simple weekend getaway to turn into the kind of experience that would haunt my memory for years. I had booked a small, secluded cabin in the mountains, somewhere far away from the noise and chaos of the city. It was the middle of October, and the forest surrounding the cabin was ablaze with the muted colors of fall, rusty reds, burnt oranges, and fading yellows. The drive had been long and winding, a series of sharp curves that tested my patience and my car's brakes. But the moment I caught sight of the cabin, tucked between towering pine and birch trees, I felt a sense of relief and excitement. The cabin itself was modest, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney that promised warmth on cold nights. There was a small porch with a creaky wooden railing, a couple of rocking chairs, and a stack of firewood neatly arranged near the door. The surrounding forest was dense enough to feel protective, like a natural wall, but thin enough that I could see hints of the distant hills and a pale blue sky. I parked my car, unloaded my backpack, and stepped inside. The interior was simple, functional, and surprisingly well-maintained. A small kitchenette, a wood-burning stove, and a dining table dominated the main room. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a small bathroom. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and old wood, and the floorboards creaked under my weight, but I found that oddly comforting. I unpacked my things, arranged them neatly on the bed, and began to settle in. The first night was peaceful. I lit a fire in the stove, brewed a cup of coffee, and sat in one of the rocking chairs on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, almost biting, and the wind whispered through the trees. I felt a deep calm, the kind that comes from being truly isolated from the world. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There were trails leading into the forest, some more obvious than others. I took one that seemed to loop around a small creek I had noticed from the cabin. The trail was narrow and uneven, littered with fallen leaves and occasional rocks that made each step precarious. I walked for hours, listening to the rush of water over stones and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Birds called overhead, and I saw deer tracks along the muddy edges of the creek. The forest was alive, but in a quiet, watchful way. By mid-afternoon, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. I turned back, following the trail I thought would lead me home, but something felt off. The forest seemed denser, darker. The shadows were long, and the sun was dipping quickly behind the hills. I quickened my pace, heart beating a little faster, but the trail became less distinct, obscured by fallen branches and thick undergrowth. The further I walked, the more I realized I had no idea where I was. Panic began to set in. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. Rows of trees, uneven ground, and the dull sound of the creek somewhere in the distance. My phone had no signal, and I had no map besides a small, old paper one that did little to clarify my position. My legs were sore, my backpack heavy, and a cold sweat clung to my back. I knew I had to find the cabin before nightfall. Night fell faster than I expected. The forest transformed. The colors drained away, leaving only black and gray shadows. The wind picked up, rustling through the leaves and making the branches sway. I could hear small animals scuttling through the underbrush, and I jumped at every sudden sound. My flashlight flickered as I tried to navigate, and I cursed myself for not bringing extra batteries. Hours seemed to pass. I stumbled over roots and rocks, occasionally catching glimpses of what I thought was a familiar landmark, only to find it unfamiliar up close. My stomach growled, and I realized I had used my water and snacks earlier than I intended. Exhaustion was settling in, making my movements clumsy. At one point, I slipped on a patch of wet leaves and fell hard against a tree. Pain shot through my shoulder, and I feared I had injured myself seriously. The thought of spending the night in the cold, alone, with a possible injury sent a chill down my spine. I continued walking, moving as quickly as my sore legs would allow, but the forest seemed endless. Then I heard it, the sound of heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, ragged and panicked, but it was separate, coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped, and I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears to catch anything else. A twig snapped to my right, followed by the low, guttural growl of an animal. My mind raced. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? I remembered the advice I had read about wildlife. Make yourself look big, make noise, and back away slowly. But I was cornered by trees and thick undergrowth, no clear escape path visible. I fumbled for a branch, anything to defend myself. My hands shook, and I realized I was shaking all over. The sound of movement drew closer, deliberate and heavy. I raised the branch, unsure whether it would do anything. The growl was closer now, accompanied by the rustle of leaves and snapping twigs. My flashlight flickered again, and in that brief beam of light, I saw a large, dark shape moving toward me. Panic surged, and I ran. I ran blindly, tripping over roots and sliding down small embankments. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Every direction I turned, the shadows were thick, oppressive, and the wind seemed to whisper threats I didn't understand. The growling, or whatever it was, had stopped, but the fear remained, gnawing at me like a living thing. I felt like the forest itself was closing in. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a small, narrow dirt road. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I didn't know which direction to take. I hesitated, my senses on high alert, listening for any signs of the creature or any other danger. I noticed tire tracks in the dirt, possibly from a maintenance vehicle or another visitor. I decided to follow them, hoping they would lead me back to civilization, or at least to my cabin. The road wound through the forest, dark and narrow. Every shadow seemed to conceal movement. I kept my flashlight ahead of me, sweeping the beam from side to side. Hours passed, and my feet were sore, my body aching. The cold night air gnawed at my fingers and ears, and I realized I hadn't dressed warmly enough for this unexpected ordeal. My water supply was gone, and my stomach ached from hunger and exhaustion. I wondered if I would ever make it back. Then I heard something else. A faint sound of running water, more distinct this time. My heart lifted slightly. The cabin was near a creek, and if I could follow the sound, I might find my way back. I adjusted my course, moving toward the rushing sound. After what felt like an eternity, I broke through a line of trees and saw the faint glow of light reflecting off the water. Relief was overwhelming. I was near the creek I had crossed earlier. From here, I recognized the path that led to the cabin. The forest didn't seem quite as intimidating now that I knew I was close. I picked up my pace, careful not to trip, listening to every snap and rustle. The cabin's silhouette appeared through the trees, and I could see the faint glow of light from the stove inside. I staggered onto the porch, dropping my backpack, my body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. I sank onto one of the rocking chairs, letting the cold air wash over me. Inside, I immediately stoked the fire, letting the warmth seep into my aching muscles. I drank water from a bottle I had stashed in the kitchenette and ate the small emergency snacks I had brought. My hands were still trembling, and my body ached from the day's ordeal, but the sense of safety was overwhelming. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Outside, the forest was quiet again, as if it had never been threatening, but I knew better. Over the next day, I rested, nursing my sore shoulder and tired legs. I reflected on the events, realizing how easily things could have gone much worse. The isolation, the unexpected wildlife, the disorientation. It had all been real and terrifying. I felt a deep respect for the wilderness and a newfound awareness of my own limits and preparation failures. By the time I left the cabin, I had packed carefully, double-checking my map, water, and supplies. The drive back was slow, deliberate, and contemplative. I thought about what had happened, the fear, the relief, and the lessons I had learned. The forest had tested me, but I had survived, and I had a clear story of survival and resilience to carry with me. Even now, years later, I remember that weekend vividly. The smell of pine, the chill of the night air, the oppressive darkness of the forest, and the fear that felt so real and immediate. But I also remember the light, the warmth of the fire, and the deep sense of relief and accomplishment when I had been planning this cabin trip for months, a solitary retreat away from the city and its constant noise, away from the hum of electricity, traffic, and people who never seemed to pause. I had chosen a cabin deep in the woods, far enough that I wouldn't hear another human for miles. My plan was simple: spend a week alone, read, write, and clear my mind. I imagined crisp mornings, the smell of pine, mist hovering over the lake at dawn, and the quiet so complete that it pressed against my ears like a soft, heavy blanket. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies to last the week. I brought books, notebooks, a sturdy flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and all the usual camping tools. I even brought some firewood and a small stove, because I wanted the experience to feel old-fashioned, removed from the convenience of modern life. The drive up the winding dirt road to the cabin was long, slower than I expected. The trees grew thick along either side, so dense that even midday sunlight barely touched the ground. Small animals darted in the shadows. I passed no houses, no signs of civilization, just the endless hum of the car engine and my own thoughts. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I had imagined but sturdy, made of dark wood that had weathered many winters. A thin trail of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I was certain no one else was there. The door creaked as I opened it, and the smell of wood, dust, and the faint scent of damp earth met me. Inside, the cabin was simple: a small kitchen area, a single bedroom with a bed covered in thick blankets, a small wood stove, and a few chairs. Windows on every side offered a view of the forest. The floorboards creaked underfoot, a reminder that the place had been built long ago. I set my things down and began unpacking. I stacked the firewood neatly near the stove, checked that the water supply in the tank was full, and made a rough inventory of the food I brought. It wasn't much, but it would do. I felt a small sense of satisfaction, the kind that comes when you've carefully prepared for something and are finally in the moment you envisioned. The first night was quiet, almost impossibly so. Without the city's constant hum, every tiny sound became noticeable. The rustle of leaves, a branch snapping somewhere in the distance, the occasional scuttle of a small animal outside. I built a fire in the stove, the wood crackling and popping as it burned, and sat close to it with a book. My flashlight lay on the table, batteries fully charged, ready if I needed it. I fell asleep later than I expected, the cabin warm and the darkness outside complete, almost pressing against the glass. The following days were a routine of quiet work and exploration. I walked along the narrow paths that led through the forest, marking the spots I might want to visit later. I fished in the nearby creek, cooking what I caught over the stove. The isolation was both peaceful and unnerving. On the third day, I realized that even the sound of the wind had a strange presence when you are utterly alone. It was during one of these walks that I noticed the first odd detail: footprints. They were not fresh, but they were recent enough that I noticed them in the soft mud near the creek. They were human footprints, leading from the forest edge toward the cabin. My heart raced as I considered it. I had seen no vehicles, no other hikers, no signs of life beyond small animals. The footprints were definitely someone's. I went back to the cabin cautiously, scanning the trees and underbrush as I walked. Nothing. The footprints ended abruptly near the tree line. That night, I stayed awake longer, sitting near the window, listening. The forest at night is not silent. There is a constant murmur of creatures moving, but sometimes there are sounds that are too deliberate, too rhythmic to be animals. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a deer or a fox, perhaps the wind shifting debris. Still, a part of me remained alert, on edge, refusing to settle. By the fourth day, I noticed more signs. Twigs bent unnaturally near the windows, a faint smear of dirt on the doorstep, and most troubling, another set of footprints in the mud that led around the cabin, not toward it. Whoever had been here had moved carefully, almost methodically. I locked the doors, even though the cabin had few locks beyond a simple latch. I placed heavy furniture against the door, not trusting it, though I knew rationally that I was alone in these woods. I told myself it was paranoia, but the instinctual tightening in my chest did not lie. The nights grew longer in my mind than they did in reality. Every sound made me flinch. The wind would knock a branch against the cabin, and I would sit rigid, eyes scanning the darkness outside. I began to notice small things missing or moved slightly. A book on the table not in the same position, the firewood stacked differently. Each small detail chipped away at my sense of security. I had prepared for solitude, but not for the possibility that I was being watched. On the fifth day, the realization hit me fully. I was not alone. I found evidence near the water tank, scratches in the wood, some smears of mud on the floor inside the cabin. Whoever it was had been careful not to leave too much evidence, but their presence was undeniable. My stomach twisted. I had no phone signal, no easy way to call for help, no neighbors for miles. The forest that had seemed so inviting and peaceful now felt like a trap, enclosing me in a vast prison of trees and shadows. I spent the day barricading the cabin further. I piled furniture in front of the windows, moved all the food to a more secure location, and kept the fire going constantly, if only to maintain a sense of control. I scouted the perimeter in daylight, marking the trees where the footprints led and noting where any signs of human presence were strongest. Whoever had been here was careful, but they were not invisible. They had left traces, and I intended to be aware of every one of them. The next night was the worst. I could hear movement just outside the cabin, slow, deliberate steps circling the structure. The shadows of branches moved across the walls as I strained to listen, my flashlight on but not daring to shine it outside. I realized I had been underestimating how dangerous this could be. Fear, sharp and physical, coursed through me. My heart pounded so hard I thought the intruder might hear it. I made a decision. I would not leave the cabin at night, and I would make sure any approach could be seen and countered. By the sixth day, I had created makeshift barriers using whatever I could find. Chairs wedged in front of doors, sharp sticks pointed toward likely entry points, and stones piled near the windows. I also began to prepare an exit strategy, mapping a route through the woods to the nearest road. I knew I couldn't rely on someone else discovering me. Survival required planning, focus, and calm under pressure. In the early hours of the seventh day, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints leading up to the cabin door, then away again, as though someone had been watching, testing, waiting. I realized then that they had been observing my movements for days, staying just out of sight, using the forest like a shield. The thought made me furious and terrified simultaneously. I felt small and vulnerable, but also determined. I spent the day preparing for a potential confrontation, not with bravado, but with strategy. I marked every route into the cabin, every blind spot, every potential hiding place around it. I gathered heavy sticks, a hatchet, and the firewood. I set traps, crude but potentially effective, using the natural terrain and fallen branches to my advantage. I was no longer thinking about a peaceful retreat. I was thinking only of keeping myself alive until I could escape. Night fell again, and the forest came alive in a way that made every shadow suspicious. I stayed alert, every sense heightened. Hours passed, slow and unrelenting. At one point, I heard the snap of a branch, then silence. Then another snap, closer this time, followed by a low rustle. My heart raced, and I gripped the hatchet tightly, ready to defend myself. I stayed still, barely breathing, as the sounds circled the cabin. Whoever it was patient, waiting for me to make a mistake. The turning point came near dawn. I noticed a faint light moving through the trees, distant but unmistakable. It was not natural. Someone had a lantern. I realized they were leaving, or perhaps searching for another point of entry. I waited until the light disappeared before allowing myself to breathe. Then, I grabbed my supplies and slipped out quietly, following the route I had scouted. The forest was treacherous, but I had marked my way carefully, and I moved as silently as possible. Every sound could mean discovery, every shadow a threat. I reached the dirt road by midday, exhausted, covered in scratches and bruises, but alive. A passing truck gave me a ride back to civilization. I reported the incident to the authorities, but the area was remote, and no immediate search could be mounted. I had no proof beyond the footprints. The first time I saw the cabin, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It stood alone at the edge of a dense forest, its dark wood weathered by years of wind and rain, the roof sagging slightly as if carrying its own history of storms. The road that led there was nothing more than a narrow dirt path, overgrown in places, flanked by towering pine trees whose needles whispered whenever the wind shifted. I had driven for hours through winding roads and patches of fog that clung to the ground like damp blankets. I needed to get away from everything, the constant noise of the city, the endless buzz of people, the weight of daily expectations. My plan was simple. Spend a week alone in this cabin, without anyone knowing, just me, the forest, and the silence. When I pulled up, the car's tires sank slightly into the soft dirt, and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves hit me immediately. I climbed out, feeling the chill of the late afternoon air settle over me, carrying with it the subtle, sour scent of pine resin and damp moss. The cabin was small, roughly 20 by 30 feet, with a single story and a tiny loft above the main living area. Its windows were dark and reflective, hiding whatever lay inside. I walked around it once, touching the walls and the door frame, noting the way the wood felt rough under my fingers, uneven and worn from decades of exposure. Inside, the cabin was dark, even with the fading sunlight filtering through the small windows. Dust floated in the air, thick enough that it made me cough when I took a deep breath. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I had to step carefully in several places where the wood seemed weak. A musty smell filled the space, a mix of damp wood, old fabric, and something else I couldn't immediately place. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A small table and 2 chairs, a rickety bookshelf filled with old, yellowing books, a metal stove in one corner that looked as though it hadn't been used in years, and a bed in the far corner with a thin, lumpy mattress. There was no running water, no electricity, and only a single candle holder nailed to the wall for lighting. It was exactly what I had expected. Isolated, uncomfortable, and entirely dependent on me for survival for the next few days. I unpacked my bag slowly, trying to ignore the tight knot forming in my stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a creeping awareness of the absolute vulnerability of this place. The nearest town was miles away, the nearest neighbor even farther, and the cell service was unreliable at best. Once the sun fell completely, I knew I would be entirely alone. I had brought food, water, and supplies, but I also knew that being alone in a place like this demanded attention to every detail. Even small mistakes could become serious problems. The first night was uncomfortable but manageable. I lit the candle, placed it on the table, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the shadows that moved as the flame flickered. Every small noise from the forest outside, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird or animal, made me tense. I reminded myself repeatedly that these were normal sounds, that the forest was alive, and that no harm was intended. Still, I couldn't shake the awareness that there was no immediate escape if something went wrong. I double-checked that the door was latched, that my backpack with supplies was within reach, and that my small flashlight was on the table beside me. Then I tried to sleep, though I kept waking every hour, listening for sounds that weren't there, imagining shapes in the dark corners of the cabin. The next day, I explored the surroundings. The cabin was surrounded on 3 sides by thick forest, with only a narrow clearing extending in front of it. I noticed signs of animals, tracks in the soft soil, droppings near the edge of the trees, and small markings on the trunks of several pine trees that indicated some creature had climbed or rubbed against them. I walked cautiously, my eyes scanning constantly for movement. The forest had a heavy silence beneath its own noise, the kind of quiet that presses in and makes you aware of every snap of a twig underfoot. I marked a few trees near the cabin to create a rough perimeter and made mental notes of the terrain in case I needed to navigate quickly. By the second night, the isolation was beginning to weigh on me. I had spent hours during the day gathering firewood and inspecting the cabin, and by the time evening came, my body was exhausted but my mind refused to calm. The wind had picked up, rustling the treetops and making the old cabin moan in response. I lay on the bed, listening to the sound of wood contracting and expanding, imagining the structural weaknesses hidden in the shadows. The candlelight trembled with each gust of wind, and the darkness outside seemed almost solid, an oppressive wall of blackness that the weak light from the cabin couldn't penetrate. I realized with sudden clarity how completely exposed I was here, how entirely dependent on my own vigilance. It was in the middle of that night that the first incident happened. I woke to a loud thump against the cabin wall, close enough to make me jump from the bed. My heart was pounding as I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the source. The beam cut through the darkness and caught a deer frozen in the clearing, its eyes wide and reflecting the light. It had apparently collided with the cabin in a panic, maybe spooked by something in the forest. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my shaking hands. I realized I hadn't locked the back door properly, which probably allowed the deer a slight gap to push against. After that, I spent the rest of the night checking every inch of the cabin, reinforcing weak spots, and ensuring that I had a clear line of sight to every entrance. The following days were a careful routine of maintenance, observation, and preparation. I inspected the roof, reinforced the hinges on the doors, and gathered more firewood, all while keeping an acute awareness of the forest. During one afternoon, I noticed something unusual. A series of tracks leading toward the cabin, larger than any deer or raccoon, partially obscured by the wind and fallen leaves. I followed them cautiously, and the tracks seemed to circle the cabin and disappear back into the woods. The realization that there might be a human presence, even at a distance, tightened the knot in my stomach. I had no immediate proof, but the possibility alone was enough to keep me alert. By the fourth night, the wind had shifted, and a storm rolled in. Rain battered the cabin with heavy, uneven pounding, and the trees bent and groaned under the force. I could see the forest floor through the windows, slick with water and mud, branches snapping intermittently. The storm made the isolation more acute. I couldn't risk going outside to reinforce anything, and I couldn't see past the cabin's immediate perimeter. I felt trapped in a wooden box, surrounded by a living, moving entity that could crush or trap me in an instant. I spent the night pacing, checking my supplies and listening to the storm. I realized I was becoming attuned to every subtle sound. The rush of water through the leaves, the thump of branches hitting each other, the occasional scurrying of small animals seeking shelter. Then, during the height of the storm, I heard a different sound. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the clearing outside. My heart sank. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but the sheets of rain distorted the beam. The steps stopped. A shadow passed past the window. I realized I had no immediate way to defend myself except the small hatchet I had brought for firewood. The rational part of me screamed that it could be anything. Another hiker, lost or unaware. But the primal part of me was frozen in fear, imagining the worst-case scenarios. The shadow disappeared, and the footsteps retreated into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the hatchet and checking every point of entry repeatedly. By the 5th day, the storm had passed. I emerged to inspect the area, walking carefully in the mud and debris left behind. The tracks outside were not human. They were large, like a bear or a large moose, but their pattern suggested the animal had circled the cabin, likely looking for shelter or food. Relief mixed with lingering anxiety as I realized I had been lucky. The forest had tested me, but I had survived without injury. I reinforced the windows and doors once more, cleared debris that could provide cover for an intruder, and carefully organized my supplies for the remaining days. The remaining days were a careful balancing act of vigilance and routine. I monitored the forest, repaired the cabin, and rationed my food and water. The fear of the unknown never entirely left me, but I learned to coexist with it, recognizing the patterns of the forest and the limitations of my isolation. By the time the 7th day arrived, I felt a cautious sense of accomplishment. I had endured isolation, severe weather, and the constant awareness of potential threats, and I had learned to rely entirely on my own skills and instincts. When I finally packed up to leave, the forest felt different, less threatening, almost familiar. I took one last look at the cabin, its dark wood glistening in the early morning sun, and I felt a deep appreciation for the endurance it had forced me to develop. The dirt road stretched ahead, and I drove. I had planned the trip for months. The idea was simple: a week alone in a remote cabin far from the city, away from the constant noise, phones, and obligations. I had rented the cabin through an online platform that promised solitude, clear streams, thick forest, and an authentic experience far from anyone else. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin with a metal roof, surrounded by dense pine and oak trees, and a narrow dirt path leading down to a small river. The map said it was a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, but the GPS warned me that after a certain point, the roads were unpaved and could be difficult for a standard car. I rented a small SUV and packed it full of supplies: canned food, a gas stove, water bottles, a first aid kit, blankets, and firewood, though the cabin was said to have a fireplace. I also brought a small hand axe, a flashlight, extra batteries, a camping knife, and some basic tools in case the cabin's old lock or plumbing acted up. The drive itself was uneventful, at least at first. The highway gradually gave way to winding roads through hills and forested valleys. Birds and small animals darted along the side of the road, and the occasional deer would appear in the distance, frozen for a moment before leaping into the undergrowth. I tried to enjoy the scenery, the way sunlight filtered through the tall trees, the smell of damp earth after recent rain. I kept the SUV in low gear as the road became rougher, full of potholes and uneven patches. Eventually, I reached a fork where a barely visible dirt road led deeper into the forest. According to the GPS, this was the correct path, though it looked as though it hadn't been maintained in years. The tires crunched over loose gravel, branches scraped against the sides of the car, and the road narrowed so much that one side of the SUV nearly brushed against the undergrowth. After about 30 minutes, the cabin came into view. It was exactly as the pictures had promised, though smaller in person. The wood was weathered, the roof had rust stains, and the chimney looked unused for a long time. The surrounding forest was thick, the trees so close that sunlight barely reached the ground. The cabin sat on a small clearing, just enough space for the car and a narrow path leading to the river below. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful, calming silence I had imagined, but a heavy, almost unnatural quiet. There was no bird song, no wind rustling the leaves, only the faint sound of water in the distance. It made my skin crawl in a way I hadn't anticipated. I unpacked the car slowly, methodically stacking the food and supplies on the wooden floor of the cabin. The door creaked as I opened it, the smell of old wood and mildew hitting me immediately. The cabin was small. A single room with a kitchenette, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a small bathroom with a rusty metal sink and an old toilet. The fireplace took up most of one wall, its bricks blackened from years of use. I set the stove and checked that the gas worked, unpacked the blankets, and started a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth and crackle of the flames helped, though I still felt a nagging unease. The first night was sleepless. I had expected it to be peaceful, but the darkness outside felt like it had weight. The forest pressed in from all sides, and every small sound, a branch breaking, a rustle of leaves, made me sit up and strain my eyes toward the windows. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons perhaps, moving in the undergrowth. I tried to read a book, but my eyes kept flicking to the shadows beyond the glass. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch, fully dressed, with the axe resting beside me. The next morning, I explored the area. The river was shallow but clear, and I spent some time walking along the bank, collecting firewood, and marking the paths I might take if I needed to leave quickly. I noticed tire tracks along the dirt road, fresh and deep, leading down toward the river and back up into the forest. They weren't mine, though I couldn't tell who they belonged to. Part of me shrugged it off. Maybe another visitor had rented the cabin previously. Still, the thought lodged in my mind like a splinter. I settled into a routine over the next few days. Gathering wood, cooking simple meals, reading and walking along the forest paths. I started noticing small things. Footprints near the cabin that weren't mine, faint sounds in the night that couldn't be explained by wind or animals, and glimpses of movement between the trees. Each time, I told myself I was imagining it. Cabin life alone tends to play tricks on your mind. On the fourth day, I went to the river to refill my water bottles. I noticed something that made my stomach knot. Footprints in the soft mud along the bank, leading both toward and away from the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, and they looked fresh. My first instinct was to panic, but I forced myself to calm down. Maybe someone else was nearby, another visitor, a hunter, or someone working in the forest. Still, it was unsettling. I decided to secure the cabin more thoroughly. I checked all the locks, blocked the windows with furniture, and placed my axe near the door. That night, I stayed awake longer than ever, listening. Around midnight, I heard it. A slow crunching of leaves, deliberate and steady, circling the cabin. The sound stopped suddenly, then started again a few minutes later, closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the windows, but saw nothing beyond the dark silhouettes of trees. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, but the rhythm was too purposeful, too controlled. Morning brought no relief. The footprints outside were unmistakable. Bare feet pressed into the soft dirt near the porch. I examined them carefully. They were small, maybe a woman's or a younger person's, and they led in circles around the cabin before disappearing into the forest. Panic surged. I had no cell signal. I had left a note for a friend on my way in, but it was only a precaution. I realized that I was completely isolated. I spent the day preparing. I collected more firewood, sharpened my axe, and made sure the stove and fireplace could sustain me for at least a week. I mapped out escape routes. The river, the dirt road, even the thick forest in case I had to run. I stayed alert, constantly scanning for movement, noting every unusual sound. That night, I slept with one eye open, the axe under my pillow. The fifth day was the worst. I woke to the sound of my front door being rattled. Someone had tried to force it open. My heart raced, my hands shook. I checked every entrance and found the latch had been tampered with. Whoever it was had come close, but hadn't succeeded. I realized then that the footprints, the noises, the circling, it wasn't random. Someone had been watching me, maybe for days. I spent the next 24 hours barricading the cabin as best I could. moving heavy furniture against the doors and windows, stacking firewood along the edges of the walls, even digging shallow trenches around the perimeter to make it harder to approach unseen. I stayed in the center of the cabin with my axe and a large kitchen knife, every sound making me jump. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I didn't respond. I didn't move. The steps stopped eventually, then retreated into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn, shivering and exhausted. The following morning, I noticed something new. A small, crude wooden structure had been built a few meters from the cabin. Just a few branches and twigs tied together with string, forming a kind of shelter. It wasn't elaborate, but it was close enough to the cabin to indicate someone had been staying there, watching me. Fear surged through me. I realized I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, taking only what I could carry. I left food, blankets, everything heavy behind. I took the SUV and drove slowly, constantly scanning the trees. Halfway down the dirt road, I saw movement. Someone crouched among the trees, watching me. I kept driving, keeping my speed low enough to maneuver, but fast enough to get away. I didn't stop until I reached the paved highway, heart pounding, hands white from gripping the wheel. Once I reached town, I went straight to the local police station. They listened, took notes, and eventually accompanied me back to the cabin. When we arrived, the wooden structure was gone, and there was no one in the vicinity. They explained that people sometimes squatted in abandoned cabins, hiding from authorities or living off the land. They searched the surrounding forest but found nothing. They said it was possible whoever had been watching me had left after realizing someone had been aware of them. I stayed in the cabin one more night, but with officers stationed nearby, I could finally sleep without the constant fear pressing down on me. The next day, I left for good, returning to the city with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. Even weeks later, I could still see the footprints in my mind, hear the crunching leaves around the cabin, and feel the heavy quiet of the forest pressing down on me. I had gone seeking peace and solitude, but instead I had been reminded how vulnerable a person can be when completely alone. The cabin itself was returned to the rental platform, but I never went